Coming up on Chasing the Natty, we are continuing our CFF 2025 Crash Course series, and this week we'll be taking a look at the wide receivers. We'll be quickly running through the top 36 wide receivers in our CFF rankings over at campusofcanton.com. Then we'll be discussing who we think is going too high and too low in drafts. And then finally, we'll be discussing the wide receiver rooms that still need some sorting out this fall. All of that and more coming right after this.
Sellers picks his way to the right and is tripped up, reaching for the end zone. Touchdown. What a start.
Give it to Reed, and there he goes. Nobody's going to catch him. Touchdown.
It's caught. Jeremiah Smith. Touchdown, Ohio State. The legend grows.
This is Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. All right, welcome in everyone. This is Jared Palmgren, host of the Chasing the Natty podcast. Hope you guys are having a wonderful ride to your work on this Monday morning. We are the college fantasy football podcast on the Campus of Canton Podcast Network. You can find us on all of your podcast feeds and on YouTube every Monday morning during the off season at 6 a.m. sharp. If you want to support the great work we do here, head on over to campuscanton.com, subscribe there with any of our phenomenal tiers. We got content ranging on all sorts of college football games, whether that's CFF, Devy, C2C, Underdog, Best Ball, anything that you play, we've got content, whether that's tools, rankings, pretty much everything you need to succeed. In fact, right now, if you want to support this show even further, make sure when you sign up for one of your yearly membership tiers, you use that promo code NATTY, N-A-T-T-Y, to get 10% off of your yearly membership. Again, those are the yearly memberships. And again, that promo code is NATTY, N-A-T-T-Y. If you can't do that, that's totally fine. You can just show us some love by leaving a like, a comment, and a subscribe on the YouTube side of things. If you're on the podcast side of things, just leave a 5-star review. Make sure you're following the show. Not only does that show us support, but just the entire game of college fantasy football in general, a ton of support. If you have any questions or want to get in touch for whatever reason, you can find me in the show on Twitter. I am at CFF_Jared. The show is at Chasing the Natty, and the handsome fellow joining me today is Mr. Austin Nace at Devi Dietz on Twitter. He, based on our conversation before the show, Austin may not think he is so handsome given the humidity affecting his hair today. Oh no, I've made poor little Austin self-conscious now. Austin, welcome to the show, man. This is the second time I've had you on in a week because we did the live show earlier this week.
I know, right? And we didn't drop the disclaimer on the live show because that was, a little more relaxed. But I think the disclaimer, I am not a CFF expert. Listen to Jared, not to me, and I think everything will work out just perfect for you.
And you will see that will come to fruition as Austin and I butt heads a lot today in the show. I'm just kidding. Austin's a very smart guy. He downplays his CFF ability, but listen, Austin, you're a Campus of Canton expert at the end of the day, and that means that you have to have some, ability to win on the college side, and that means you have CFF skills. And so
I always say, I'm obviously C2C and recruiting and stuff is kind of more my realm at this point. I rely on CFF experts like you guys and, like plenty of other places, Law, the CFF site guys, Fantasy Points guys, all of them. I have a handful of opinions that I hold pretty closely that maybe don't jive with the consensus there every year. But I rely a lot on you guys. So shout out to all you guys for all the work that you do, so I don't have to deep dive Toledo stuff in May every year.
Well, I know we'll get to a couple of your closely held takes at wide receiver here today for sure, but other positions I'm curious about, Austin. What are some closely held positions that you think differ from the rest of the CFF community at quarterback and running back?
I don't know if it differs, but I'm pretty much all in on Nate Palmer this year at TCU ever since there's been some rumblings. I know when I was on the show a couple years ago, I had mentioned, I just really like kind of deeper running backs that are attached to really strong offenses that I think are just have a really good chance to fall into the end zone, 12 to 15 times. And I think not only does he have that, but obviously some great, I think there's some potential for some nice, yardage totals there as well. So he's probably my big guy this year that I've been taking, him and Rodney Fields. If I can get both of them in drafts, I'm pretty darn happy.
No, definitely some two great running back picks, and honestly, again, we did the last round running back show a couple weeks ago with Justin Leo, aka Volume Pigs, and those are two guys that we absolutely could have brought up in that because they're both going super late. I want to believe in Nate Palmer, but boy, am I still jaded from all the Cam Cook that I drafted last year, and everything feels very reminiscent of that now.
And now you're back in on Cam Cook a little bit, I hear.
I am. At Jacksonville State, I am.
Time is just a circle.
Yeah. I mean, it sets up super well for him over there, but I'm sure I'll get burned 2 years in a row. That's just how these things go. So, as I mentioned at the start of the show, we're doing the wide receiver crash course today. We're going to run through our top 36 wide receivers over in our CFF guide. More on that in a second. We'll also touch on some guys we think are going too high and too low in CFF drafts. And then we'll discuss some competitions. But speaking of that CFF guide, that is out. That is available to you all. That is $20 over at campusofkent.com. Nearly 300 pages of golden CFF content. We have team profiles breaking down all 100 and what do we got? 36 teams in the FBS now. We got 48 quarterback profiles, 60 running back profiles, 72 wide receiver profiles, 36 tight end profiles, and then we got rankings on there that go even deeper. There's tons of great extra stuff towards the back, including our own Justice's, defensive stats and streaming guide, which is unique to our guide. So he does a fantastic job with that. Definitely go check that out. Again, it's super, super great content for $20. So make sure you check that out. And as I mentioned before, make sure you go subscribe to campusofkenton.com. We have so many tools on there that we really don't even talk about enough about how many great tools we have over there. Austin, I think we mentioned on the live show, you talked about the roster management tool there. What's another one of your favorite tools that we have over at c2c.com?
I mean, I think you see the charts everywhere that people will do from the metric plots. You can chart out pretty much any stat that you want for pretty much any position, over the course of a player's career and see how it compares to kind of the median future NFL fantasy contributor, which I think is really, really helpful. I think we have data on that going back to like 2004 or 2006. I forget which year exactly. If you're more of a sicko even than I am, I think a lot of the like advanced college team stats and coach tendency stuff can be really helpful as well, just to get a feel for how coaches tend to coach, on a year-to-year basis. And obviously some years you'll get some outlier type stuff, maybe dictated by talent. But I think, we have that data going back to like literally 1900, I think. I think it basically goes back to the beginning of time. So if you're, anything from like sicko kind of stuff like that to, you want to see how Devonta Smith yards per route run were every year of college. I mean, we've kind of run the gamut. So I think a lot of good stuff in there for sure.
I love that coaching tendencies tool. We use it all the time in our CFF guide. The one thing I will tell people, and this is something I know I've been asked about this before, it does only do head coaches. I believe, Austin, we're working on getting offensive coordinator data, but that's always kind of hard because it's like who's really calling plays and stuff like that, right? So
it's much spottier, unfortunately, in terms of finding reliable year-over-year coordinator stuff. But it is something that we are trying to get. Yeah.
So enough of that. Enough of the glazing of our content over at campusofkent.com, although we could definitely make an entire show based on that. Let's start talking about these wide receivers, Austin. I like to begin each of these Crash Course series with just a general discussion of the wide receiver class this year for CFF in general. To me, wide receiver is much like running back in that there's very few options at the top that you can rely on, and then things kind of get really weird really quick. But unlike running back, I do think there's kind of a reason to play into the uncertainty at wide receiver and why I'm okay with drafting running backs early and then kind of waiting on wide receivers. Because wide receivers, even the good ones in CFF, are extremely volatile compared to running backs. Running backs typically make up the core of your team. Your wide receivers, you're plugging those guys in, hoping that they can have that breakout game that gets you 30, 40 points, right? But they could just as easily end up getting you 10 points, right? So to me, in drafts, you're far more likely to find wide receivers with that high upside later on in drafts, at least on kind of a weekly basis, if not season long, compared to running backs. Like, you see this a lot in my projections. Like between my wide receiver 30 and wide receiver 100 in my projections, there's about a total of 20 fantasy points difference across the whole season according to my projections, which, in reality, you're going to see a bigger difference than that. Like in 2024, we saw about a 50-point difference between wide receiver 30 and wide receiver 100. But that includes like injuries, guys, just completely bottoming out compared to what that median projection kind of holds for them. But in projections, like I said, we kind of find that median outcome. You would be surprised just how many of these guys over the course of a full season, and everybody assuming to play 11 to 12 games, average about the same in total points, right? And so because of that, in lineup versus best ball, I think wide receiver is where you're going to see kind of the biggest difference in the type of player you're going to want to draft compared to other positions. And like I said, there's just a lot more volatility, right? 2 wide receivers might be projected for 150 fantasy points on the season, but how they get there is a completely different story, right? Like for best ball, you'll want that guy who may be in on like the lower end of that 150 points like projected range, but could pop off for 40 points twice in the year, but get 7 points the rest of the season, right? That's more valuable, obviously, in best ball. Meanwhile, in a lineup league, you'll want that guy that maybe doesn't crack above 25 fantasy points the whole season, but by golly, you'll never see him get less than 12, 13 points, right? So wide receiver, there's a lot more guys that I think can fit into both of those categories, and why I think that, making sure you know which guys are which in your rankings and making sure you have a nice balance of both when you're drafting will help out a ton. That's a lot to say. There's a lot of volatility at the wide receiver position. I think you can play into that because of just how the position works. Austin, I'm monologuing too much here. What do you think about wide receivers this year?
No, I completely agree. And I think it's actually even you're seeing some more weird stuff this year if you're doing campus to Canton leagues, and specifically, established leagues that are kind of just doing supplemental drafts this offseason. Because if you look, this is the first year I can remember where a lot of the top CFF options are also like legitimate NFL draft prospects, like very, very high end guys, Jeremiah Smith, Ryan Williams, all the Clemson receivers, Cam Coleman, Jordan Tyson, like Mekhi Lemon, like all these dudes are very much rostered in all of our C2C leagues, which is, I think, a little different than normal years. So for me this offseason, I've been leaning into some of these offenses that look like they're going to throw for a ton of yards, and we're just not really sure which guy maybe is the top guy, or maybe we kind of figure who the top guy is, and we don't really know who the second is. Because I do think on average, we're probably pretty good. Like the Royal We are pretty good at figuring out which offenses are going to be pretty prolific. We just aren't necessarily always as good as kind of figuring out what that hierarchy at the receiver position is going to look like because of just the nature of college football. So that's been my strategy this offseason. It's what I've been doing taking a lot of, TCU wide receivers down the depth chart, both of the UTSA guys, guys further down LSU's depth chart, and so on and so forth. Just kind of hoping that maybe a couple of swings there will find me some gold.
And it can change week to week. That's the other part of wide receiver that's so different than running back, right? Like it's entirely matchup proof. Like most time you're not going to see a team completely sub out which running back they're going to hand the ball off to 20 times a game unless they take a hot hand approach, in which case, we're avoiding that situation if that's what the coach tends to do anyway. But wide receiver, it's expected that, you can have a guy that you expect about 10 targets per week, but those are few and far between. You're mostly going to find a lot of offenses that have to kind of play the mismatch wherever it is on the field, and we can see it even with a team like Ohio State, right? Jeremiah Smith's a beast, but there's going to be weeks where defenses are good enough to try to lock him down, and that'll open things up for a guy like Carnell Tate or whoever they have in the slot this year, right? That's just an example. So, yeah, I agree. You play into that uncertainty a little bit. Target teams with high passing volumes. I know a lot of people, have targeted Florida Atlantic this year with, Caden Velkamp, Easton Messer there. Obviously, 2 top guys that go pretty high in drafts, but I see tons of people taking shots on late round wide receivers in that Florida Atlantic room, just trying to grab who could be that second guy that pops off there. You mentioned TCU, another great example. So, yeah, not a bad strategy at all. And again, another reason why I do think you can wait on wide receiver a little bit. But there are guys at the top here, Austin. And so I think that's a great segue over to discuss our top wide receivers for this year. I'll run through our top 12 this year. And that is, at number 1, we have Jordan Tyson, the wide receiver out of Arizona State. At number 2, we have Jeremiah Smith, the wide receiver out of Ohio State. At number 3, we have Ryan Williams out of Alabama. At number 4, we have Easton Messer, the wide receiver out of Florida Atlantic. At number 5, we got Deion Burks out of Oklahoma. At number 6, Cam Coleman out of Auburn. At number 7, Denzel Boston out of Washington. At number 8, we have Eric McAllister out of TCU. At number 9, we have Ted Hurst, the wide receiver out of Georgia State. At number 10, Elijah Surratt out of Indiana. At number 11, we have Junior Vandeross out of Toledo. And number 12, we have Antonio Williams out of Clemson. So, real quick, a couple explanations. One, I had a couple people ask me about this last week. These are not our top 12 in projections. These are our top 12 in expert consensus rankings among our 3 CFF experts at campus2canton.com that provide rankings. So these are not my rankings. This is a combination of me, Ethan Sowers, and Chris K, all combining our heads together. So a little bit of clarification on that. 2, if you've watched the Crash Course series, you know what I'm about to say here. But for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, I'd love to talk about all 12 of these wide receivers in depth. Unfortunately, Austin and I can't be here for 17 hours. And so
I've got time. This is a you issue. This is not a me issue.
You're right. But the problem is, Austin, for anybody that knows me, if I start podcasting past 10 o'clock at night, things get weird real quick. And things are already getting weird. So we're gonna each pick 2 guys in this range that we kind of want to break down a little bit further. And so, Austin, we'll throw over to your guys first here. You want to discuss two different guys here. One of those Devy upside, or not Devy upside, but just like one of those top end Devy guys, and Ryan Williams at Alabama. You also want to discuss Junior Vandeross out of Toledo. Let's start with Ryan Williams here, a wide receiver 3. What do you want to discuss about him?
Yeah, so I think Williams has a really nice floor this year. So I get, because for some of this at the top, the situation is going to be like, he's not going to finish worse than wide receiver 18 or whatever. Like you got to take him pretty early. That's just kind of what Williams feels like. But I am a little less optimistic about the actual like high end upside for him. Like I actually think in a full PPR league, I prefer some of the guys to go just a couple, Messer over him, maybe even Burks because of like that offensive system itself. I know last year a lot of his struggles, especially in the second half of the season, can be attributed to Jalen Milroe.
Yes,
who I'll be Southern with you for a minute, Jared. Bless his heart. He tried. He tried. He's just not like, he's a dual threat quarterback. He is, putting him in the pocket, having him throw 30, 35, 40 times a game, not his thing. And with the lack of other wide receivers in that team, I think, other SEC schools kind of figured out pretty quickly, will basically bracket Williams. So they don't really have a lot else here.
If only Georgia could have figured that out.
They tried. I feel like even on that catch downfield, they had 2 on him. It just didn't matter. Like one of the best catches I've ever seen in my life. But so I see the arguments for like high end upside. This staff has produced some real strong wide receiver finishes in the past. In fact, has put together like multiple strong wide receiver finishes in a single season in the past. And it does seem like Ty Simpson is a guy that can come in and kind of do what some of these other more pocket quarterbacks have done in this offense with Grubbs and with oh wow, his name just totally went out of my head.
DeBoer.
Yes, DeBoer. On the other side, Simpson unproven, was not good the last time we saw him. Granted, that was 2 years ago in kind of a weird situation. So, you can kind of take that performance however you want. And I still don't think the other wide receivers, I got to see some proof that they can get open consistently enough where you can't just double Ryan Williams and kind of shut down this passing attack. So for me, I like Ryan Williams, love Ryan Williams, think he's going to be awesome in the the rest of his career in the NFL, hopefully, fingers crossed. But I am a little lower on him. 3 is rich for me. If you said he was like 9-10, I would probably be more into that. But again, I get the arguments for, and the fact that I think the floor is definitely there for him.
I think Ryan Williams and really Cam Coleman being this high, one, are a testament to how great they looked last year, that you're just kind of automatically assuming that their talent alone should get them pretty high. But that's exactly what it is indicative of. there's not a lot of proven guys coming back this year, and so people are kind of leaning into the higher end talent that is available, especially among younger wide receivers, and that has pushed Ryan Williams up quite a bit. Dude's a household name for college football. People know who Ryan Williams is, and it's no surprise that people just want to lean into the best wide receiver on Alabama, a team that you know is going to score, a team that you know is going to get you what you need. It's just a matter of, can they improve on last year? Like you said, Jalen Milroe, not a great passer, and that really kind of stunted the ceiling of the wide receivers. But you mentioned before, guys like Rome Odunze, Jalen McMillan, Jalen Polk, like these guys have popped off greatly for CFF in the past, and so that's what people are kind of seeing with Ryan Williams. If DeBoer and Grubb can do it with those guys, Ryan Williams should be a shoo-in to finish pretty high. But again, it's not as simple as that. Williams finished as a wide receiver 32 in total points last year, wide receiver 46 in fantasy points per game, and boy, was it a tale of two halves. You're talking about a top 12 wide receiver through 7 weeks. Second half of the season, last 7 weeks, wide receiver 118. Now, again, I agree with you. Milroe was a big part of that, and Milroe's collapse in the second half of the season was almost certainly a huge part of that. But Ryan
I
Williams
also don't think they had a very good relationship.
You don't think so?
Based on some of the body language at the end of the year between the two of them, I don't know that there was a great relationship there.
Again, my not theory. Again, I know some stuff and everything, but like there was some politics in terms of keeping Milroe out there as the starter, and I don't think like Williams was not part of that posse in terms of like him, being there, like being new there. He was not part of that posse.
The 17-year-old kid, they didn't give a lot of input. Yeah.
Well, no, not only that, but like Milroe was the glue to keeping so many guys on that roster because there were a lot of guys on that roster that did love him. Yeah. And so if you bench Milroe again, especially in the middle of a tumultuous season already, DeBoer didn't want that kind of mutiny on his hands. So I think that's part of the reason why Milroe was out there. And I don't think Williams was super thrilled about that given how things were going second half of the season. So,
yep.
But like I said, or as I was saying, Ryan Williams, obviously Milroe was a big cause of that, but he did, have a 12.7% drop percentage. So like that's a little concerning. Obviously he's a freshman, clean that up, should be fine. Keyword should have some more stability at quarterback. I think Simpson fits this offense a little bit more. We'll see. I don't have a ton of shares of Williams. In fact, I think the only share I have of him comes in the Tadpole Bowl because I was super late in the first round and he seemed like a really good pick at that time. But otherwise, I kind of agree with you, Austin. For the most part, this is a range that I'm not really taking wide receivers too much. And so I've mostly passed on him this year, but don't blame anybody for betting on talent. Let's talk about the other guy you want to talk about in this range, Junior Vandeross, the wide receiver out of Toledo. What do you have to say about him?
I do appreciate that you put a little note under it when I highlighted him. It says, yeah, this is kind of a weird one. And yeah, it is a weird one because sure, this offense, I wouldn't necessarily call it a high volume pass offense, but they definitely funnel targets to specific, 1 or 2 players every year. So I get it if it's going to be Vandeross this year. I'm not necessarily sure that it is. They did also bring in Trayvon Rudolph, and we'll see how healthy he is. But I think just like on a sheer talent basis, he is a better player than Vandeross. So what does that dynamic look like? I've actually taken a little bit of Rudolph later in drafts this offseason, just on the off chance that is the case. He's just like a low ADOT, not super explosive guy. He only had 5 touchdowns last year. Like, okay, I guess if you think just based on the sheer amount of targets he gets, that number should go up. I think because of his role, I don't think that's necessarily a guarantee by any stretch. So that is a little bit concerning. And I just don't – I have a hard time trusting some of these MAC wide receivers because of how these offenses – it is probably the lowest level of competition in the FBS. And so you'll get these just wildly oscillating performances on a week-to-week basis where you're like, well, they're playing, Miami of Ohio or like, they're like the 112th pass defense. And then the team scores like 8 points. You're like, how did this happen? Like, so I tend to avoid some of these MAC receivers, especially this early in drafts. So for me, Vandeross is a guy, I might have drafted him once, but I really haven't been just as like if I'm wrong, then yeah, I've got him here in this spot. But I am not buying him. I'm not necessarily buying Toledo as a whole. It's just it's yeah, I don't like him this high.
Yeah, I put the note underneath it saying like, yeah, this is kind of a weird one. One, because again, I have him as wide receiver 21 in my rankings, and so I'm kind of shocked to see in consensus that he's as high as wide receiver 11. Um, but on one hand, I kind of get it, right? Like Harwan Newton finishes wide receiver 16 last year in total points, wide receiver 23 in fantasy points per game. Vander Ross finishes wide receiver 81, 108. Him and Newton both got 100 plus targets in the regular season. So again, you like that volume right there. But the problem with Vander Ross is that he hasn't really been super efficient, right? He brought in 10.5 yards per catch, while Newton was bringing in about 14.8 yards per catch. That does create a pretty significant difference between those two. But what I kind of started to see as I looked at Vander Ross, I gave him another look, because he is somebody I've kind of accepted is a relatively high pick and haven't really taken a lot of him. Like, this kind of gave me an opportunity to really look at him again. What I think people are really buying into is a very high floor PPR player here, because Vander Ross's catch percentage is great. He brought in 70% of his targets the last couple of years, which on 100 targets, that's 70 receptions. That's gold for a PPR league, right? I'm keeping him at 100 targets on the season, which is what he had last year, even though I do think there's absolutely room for more. Like, if he is, like, if, say, Rudolph doesn't really work out, who else on this team is really going to step up, right? Because Newton vacates 100 targets. I don't think the rest of that Toledo room's great. They're unproven at best. And so when I plug in 100 targets for him, based on the last 2 years, both in terms of the system and what Vander Ross has done himself, the line puts him at about 71 receptions, 809 yards, and 7 touchdowns. That puts him at wide receiver 21. I don't think he gets much higher than that, but I think that's a very solid floor for him. And I think that's where people are looking at with Vander Ross. They see safety. He's a top MAC wide receiver returning with his quarterback, so there's not much projection there, right? Toledo should be favored in most of their games, except for which game Jason Candle decides to mail in at some point during the season. Their out of conference isn't bad. They have Kentucky week 1, which, let's be real, given all the SEC versus Big Ten talk recently, that seems like a prime opportunity for Toledo to upset Kentucky and give the anti-SEC crowd something to hang their hat on all season. Let's also not forget that Toledo destroyed Mississippi State last year, so it's not like they can't, pull one of those big upsets like that, right? So I think there's a lot of I think there's safety in Vander Ross, and I think people are looking for that with him. That's why I think he's kind of going this high.
Do you think there's any risk in them running the ball a little more this year with Chip Triano coming in as well?
Oh, 100% they're going to run the ball more this year. And so again, that's why I said that, like, I can't really take his target projection and give him that much more than what he got last year, because I don't know, like, I know you said you're kind of in on Rudolph. I don't think Rudolph's as good as we kind of make him out to be. I think we're all still hanging our hat on that 300-yard game he had back like 3 years ago at this point, hoping that he can hit that ceiling once again. Maybe he does, but he's not a one-to-one replacement for Harwan Newton. He doesn't play the same kind of role. And so I do think that you're going to see Vander Ross still kind of command those targets. And maybe Rudolph has less targets, more efficient, so they end up about the same. But that's just kind of my thought on the Toledo wide receiver room. I agree with you. They probably run the ball more, but Vander Ross, I think, will still get his. It's just he'll have a higher target percentage compared to what he had last year, but it still ends up about 100 targets. So, all right, let's discuss some of my guys that I want to touch on in this range, and I'm gonna touch on 2 guys who start with the letter E here, with Eric McAllister, wide receiver 8 at TCU, and then I want to discuss Elijah Surratt at Indiana. Start with my boy Eric McAllister. I, to start the season, was captain of the Eric McAllister fan club for this upcoming season, and I still am. Let me be very clear about that. It's just that my hype has pushed him up into the second round, which is not a place I love to grab wide receivers, unfortunately, and so I haven't grabbed him as much recently. But boy, to start the season, if he was there in the third round, it was an instant draft pick for me every single time. Let me discuss why I love Eric McAllister this upcoming season in a year where there's not a lot of proven options. I think that there's a lot to like about McAllister and his projectability for this season. I think that if it weren't for the fact that TCU had 2 stud senior receivers on the outside for wide receiver last year, we would have seen McAllister already have a true breakout season, right? We would have seen that McAllister was their best performing wide receiver last year. Categories that McAllister led the Horned Frogs in last season as a borderline starter. He'd be out there in like 4 wide receiver sets and stuff like that. Yards per reception, yards after catch per reception, yards per route run, and then he was second only to Jack Beck in touchdown rate and ADOT. Those are all great predictors in terms of future performance for his role. Last year, he only got 49 targets in 12 games as a backup option at outside wide receiver, which is a pretty impressive target amount to get when you're not even one of the top 2 guys out there at the outside position. And with those limited targets, he outproduced both Savion Williams and J.P. Richardson in receiving, who were both starters at the time. Granted, Savion Williams got kind of moved to running back at one point, so there's a little bit of a caveat there. But even still, as I've said on this show before, TCU loses 291 regular season targets between Jack Beck, Savion Williams, J.P. Richardson, Drake Dabney, and Cam Cook. Now, obviously, I don't expect nearly all those targets to go to McAllister, but can he get 40 of them? Can he get 50 of them even? Like if so, that puts him in the 90 to 100 target range. And the bowl game kind of suggested that he would be able to get to that number of 90 to 100 targets, because when he was one of the guys in that bowl game, when the starters there, he got 9 targets. You put that over 12 games, it's 108 targets. Obviously a very small sample size, but it is still indicative. They'll feed him once he's one of the starters. If you give a guy 90 to 100 targets to a guy that has a catch rate of 58% and almost 19 yards per catch over the last 2 years, and whose spot in the system has normally brought in about 67% of its balls and 15 yards per catch, you can bet your sweet bottom dollar that's a lock-in for about 1,000 yards, if not more barring injury. I think McAllister is set to do extremely well for TCU this year. What do you think, Austin?
Yeah, I don't want to say converted over the course of the offseason, but my co-host on Campus Life, Colin Decker, is a really big Eric McAllister guy. I think the larger, kind of Devy projecting forward to the NFL type of group is also kind of bullish on McAllister. I've been more on the line of I just don't think he's that talented overall. And I thought last year was kind of indicative of the fact that he was outperformed by multiple guys that I don't think are stars by any stretch of the imagination. Wait a little bit on me.
He only got outperformed by Jack Beck in terms of yardage.
I've been looking at Savion as like his combined yardage, and I think that combined yardage is over him just because of the usage. But yeah, I think he is probably the obvious wide receiver 1 there. I trust in Josh Hoover quite a bit. I just think he's really good. I think they're going to throw for a ton of ton of yardage this year. I love this offense as a whole. I've been just buying up pieces of it all offseason if I could. This Baylor, a couple other ones are ones that I've just, indiscriminately buying pieces of. And so, yeah, I mean, I'll cede that I think that he's going to be awesome this year. Top 12 feels right, 8, 10, 11, whatever number you wanted to put in there.
I've got him at 4.
There you go. I think anywhere in that range feels fine to me for sure. I think I started off the offseason with him as like my wide receiver 80, and I think he's up in the 40s now. So he's bumped up
C2C rankings to be clear to everybody.
Yes, a little different.
So, all right, let's discuss Elijah Surratt, the other wide receiver I want to discuss in this range. And despite him finishing as just the wide receiver 41 in total points last year, wide receiver 61 in fantasy points per game, I'm here to tell you that I think Surratt's one of the best floor plays at wide receiver this year. And like I said, considering that he finished, in the 40s in total points, 60s in fantasy points per game, you might be wondering, like, Jared, why do you have him so high? Like, I've got him wide receiver 5. That sounds crazy. Well, my friends, it is because Surratt has a very rare combo in this year's wide receiver pool in terms of what he's been able to do so far. He has fantastic hands, pulling in about 73.8% of his targets over the last 2 years. And in addition to that, he is very efficient. He's averaged about 16 yards per play over the last couple of years. That combination can really, really work for you in terms of predicting future success in CFF. And it's also weird because he's a very weird talent evaluation, Austin. I'm sure you can kind of elaborate on this. I know you discussed it on the latest Campus Life episode, but dude is not super athletic at all. He's got a 0.477 star index, which is our athleticism score rating over at campuscanton.com. His speed score is like in the 9th percentile, I think is how I read that correctly. Not a very fast dude at all, but like if he's so slow, like how is he so efficient in his receiving? Now, granted, that could be Kirk Cignetti just knowing how to use them. Well, good news. He is still with Kirk Cignetti. But everywhere Surratt's gone, he's been able to maintain that efficiency. 18.1 yards per catch and 2.7 yards per route run. Last year at Indiana, at James Madison, he had 14.6 yards per catch and 2.86 yards per route run. And then at St. Francis, he had 16.8 yards per catch, 2.06 yards per route run. No matter what level of competition is, he is able to produce. Right? Like I said, he's back with Cignetti, so we don't have to worry about a coaching change. I personally think he's getting an upgrade at quarterback. I know Curtis Rourke was a very nice, like, veteran quarterback for Indiana to have last year, but I do think Mendoza is an upgrade over him. The wide receiver room's basically cleared out outside of Amari Cooper. Granted, mostly slot guys left, but even still, I think that just leaves more room for Surratt to outperform what he did last year. Speaking of last year, he got to 77 targets in the regular season. I think that in his swan song season, I'm never writing that for myself ever again. That is hard to say. In his last season, with a better quarterback play, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that he can get back to the 90 targets that he saw during his time at James Madison. If so, given his recent catch percentage and efficiency the last couple of years, he'll hit 1,000 yards in the regular season. He'll outperform what he did last year.
Yeah, I mean, I think you summed it up as, he is, I think, one of the best floor plays out there. I think, and I agree with you, quarterback upgrade. I think he's probably clearly the guy. There's not a lot else really there with him this year. I think you pencil him in for, what do you say he had last year from a target perspective? It's like high 70s.
Yeah, high 70s.
I think, I'd expect 15, 20 more targets in that at minimum, which again, with his efficiency numbers, it's been sticky enough that I think is one of the rare guys that you're like, oh yeah, well, actually you can actually pencil him in for similar efficiency over the next 20 catches or whatever, as we try to do every offseason. And it often doesn't necessarily work out that way. So yeah, I agree with everything that you just kind of laid out there. Again, not a guy that I draft a lot of in C2C drafts, because as you kind of mentioned, what's the long-term upside there, and he's kind of expensive in drafts. And so for me, I've been avoiding him a little bit, but I think he's in for a good season for sure.
Again, I just find it so weird that like he's able to be so efficient without the speed component. That to me that speaks to talent elsewhere in his game, whether or not he's able to shake defenders. Like, you can probably explain it better than I can, Austin. Like, how would a guy like this, who has such a very, like, we're not talking about like just average speed, we're talking about like very slow. How would a guy like this be able to get this much efficiency so consistently?
Yeah, I mean, it's the technical ability, I think, to a certain extent, and especially in college, if you don't have to be an amazing athlete, if you can, sell routes well with, your eyes, your head, whatever else. And I think the system, being paired with Cignetti for so long, we've seen Cignetti do this over and over and over again. He just puts players in positions that, for them to pick up easy yardage and for them to succeed. So I think it's kind of a combination of those two things, really.
All right. Let's move on to our wide receivers 13 through 24. We'll start with at number 13. We have Dejon Stribling, the wide receiver out of Ole Miss, formerly of Oklahoma State. Number 14, we got Corey Rucker out of Arkansas State. At number 15, we got Eugene Wilson III out of Florida. At number 16, Makai Lemon out of USC. Number 17, Chase Sowell out of Iowa State. Number 18, we have David Amador II out of UTSA. And number 19, we have Dane Key out of Nebraska. Number 20, we have Matthew Coleman, wide receiver out of San Jose State. Number 21, we got Caden Lee out of Ole Miss. Number 22, we got Chris Bell out of Louisville. Number 23, we got Ryan Wingo out of Texas. And number 24, we have Carnell Tate out of Ohio State. Austin, I let you go first last time with your two picks, so I will throw mine up here first. And I'm going to cheat. I'm going to discuss both the Ole Miss wide receivers here because I wanted to discuss one. I figured might as well discuss both of them because they kind of go hand in hand with each other. And then the other guy that I'll want to discuss in this range is Chase Sowell out of Iowa State. We'll get to him in a second. Like I said, let's discuss both Dejon Stribling and Caden Lee here. They're both in the wide receiver 2 range here. It's been back and forth between a lot of different people on like who is the wide receiver to own at Ole Miss this year. My stance, I'm going to be the little kid in the taco commercial, and I'm going to say, ¿por qué no los dos? Why can't we have both? Right? obviously, I don't think either one of these guys is set to do what Trey Harris was doing last season. That guy was on his way to being a top 3 wide receiver on the year. He could have possibly finished wide receiver 1 with how much he was being fed. He could have had a Heisman campaign. Dude was just absolutely phenomenal. He had a 5.12 yards per route run, which is like, I don't even know if we have a category for how elite that is. But because of that, because I don't think either one of these guys are going to be fed like Harris was, I think there's room for both of these guys as long as Austin Simmons is who we think he is, right? Stribling, he plays on the outside. Where Harris was, he's a big play threat. He had 17 yards per reception last year, 2.4 yards per route run. And we know that Kiffin loves guys like that. He loves those big play threats on the outside. If you're going after a system play, I think Stribling is your guy. Yes, over Harrison Wallace coming in from Penn State. I trust Stribling more. I think that Stribling's probably in line for about 80, 90 targets, which should be enough to get him into that 900 to 1,000 yard range. Meanwhile, Caden Lee is your, quote, that boy good pick. And he's also now the veteran pick, as I found out, because, I say veteran because Lee is literally the only wide receiver from last year with a target returning to Ole Miss, which I thought they would have more, but a lot of guys end up leaving out of that room. So, but yeah, Lee is he's good. System be damned. I'm going after the talent here, right? Lee took over in the slot last year in his second year with this offense, and he was phenomenal. 16.7 yards per reception, which is golden for any slot receiver. Like if you get a slot receiver that's averaging that amount of yards per catch, you're looking at a really good wide receiver. He had 2.16 yards per route run. And while Lee only got 63 targets in 12 games last year, I think he can get to what Jordan Watkins provided in 2023, where Watkins got 75 targets. And according to my projections, that's good enough to get Lee to about 57 receptions, 873 regular season yards. That'll do for CFF in 12 games right there, right? Dart averaged about 333 pass attempts in 12 games in his 3 years at Ole Miss. I've currently got Austin Simmons projected about 350. I expect them to throw the ball a little bit more a la what we had last year. So if I'm getting Stribling about 85 targets out of that and Lee about 75 targets, that's a target percentage of about 24.3%, 21.4%. I don't think that's super unreasonable at all. And I think those target numbers, if we can get to those, will get us both Stribling and both Stribling and Lee to CFF relevance this year. I don't think we need to butt heads about this. Draft one or the other, whichever one's your favorite. I think you're both going to be fine. What do you think about the Ole Miss wide receiver room, Austin?
Big Stribling guy. Took him in like the 5th or 6th round of the Tadpole Bowl and couldn't believe he was still there as my wide receiver 1 in that draft, and was totally happy with that. I think that I'll one up you a little. Like I do think he's the clear one there. I like Caden Lee. I think he serves a certain role for them, but I don't know that he quite has the chops to be the guy or like close to the guy in terms of raw production in any given year. I really think, and I guess I've backed off my skepticism on Austin Simmons a little bit this offseason, but I think that's really the only thing that can slow these guys down. And I am a little skeptical on Simmons. Like, okay, he flashed in a handful of snaps or whatever against Georgia last year.
Yes.
Which, granted, if you're going to have somebody flash in a couple of snaps, that's probably one of the matchups that you're cool with that happening in. That makes you feel maybe a little better than against a MAC school or something. But I am still a little cautious on him and what it means if he isn't quite what people are assuming. Because we know that Kiffin is pretty flexible, and if I think that's not working, they've got a lot of okay running backs, and they might just rotate some of those guys in and run the ball a little more. So I think that's really the only thing that slows them down. But yeah, I'm a big Stribling guy this year for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I basically put that caveat in there that's like, as long as Austin Simmons is who we think he is, and I'm pretty high on Simmons. Trust me, I got front row seats to watching him destroy my dog's defense for a drive last year. Then these guys should be fine.
I'm always a little hesitant on those guys that come in for one drive because it's just like stuff that the defense isn't necessarily expecting. And not that it's like he was doing something wildly different than what Jackson Dart does. You just don't have necessarily a read on a guy I'm sure they watched zero Austin Simmons tape that week. I
don't think there was much Austin Simmons tape for them to watch.
And you look at the high school. That's why the Angeli stuff is always made me a little cautious as well, because when he would step in for Notre Dame last year in a spurt here, a spurt there. The defense just is not necessarily always prepared for these guys. So.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to the other wide receiver I want to talk in this range. That is Chase Sewell out of Iowa State. You guys have listened to me for any period of time. You are very, very aware of the fact that I am not super keen on G5 to Power 4 transfers. So that kind of raises the question of why am I okay with Chase Sewell being here in our top 24 wide receivers? And I personally have him at wide receiver 23. I've got him at a slight confidence discount due to that transfer. So don't get me wrong, I'm not completely ignoring it. However, I didn't go nearly as harsh with my confidence discount as I normally do for G5 to Power 4 guys for a couple of reasons here, right? One, I think Sewell is a great replacement for Higgins, right? They're built very similarly, both at 6'4", although Higgins outweighed Sewell by a good 20 pounds. So we'll see how Iowa State is able to handle that difference, whether they put some weight on Sewell or they're okay with him, that weight difference, right? But regardless, same height. Sewell performed extremely well at the G5 level, right? Averaging almost 20 yards a catch last year, 2.76 yards per route run. While I don't think those numbers are going to translate directly, they do tell me that you are looking at a guy that was probably playing above his competition level. So I do kind of trust him a little bit more to translate from the G5 to the Power 4 compared to some other guys that might be doing that. Iowa State just proved with Higgins that they are able to take these lower level wide receivers and translate them to the Big 12. Any recruiting team that's able to spot a talent like Higgins, I trust their judgment. And if that same staff identifies Sewell as their replacement, once again, I will trust their judgment. And then the other thing that really kind of strikes me here is I don't really see anybody else on this wide receiver room that can really be Sewell's competition, right? Obviously, Higgins and Noel are gone. Who's your next guy? Carson Brown, Eli Green, Xavier Townsend comes in, he transfers in, and he looks like the best guy to be competition. But one, he's in the slot, so you're not even competing with him on the outside. And then as we'll get into the show a little bit later, I'm not a huge fan of Townsend. So I'm really big on Sewell just being a clear number one guy there. And like I said, we'll get to Townsend later, but let's assume I'm right just right now. And, Townsend isn't very good or wasn't nearly as good as Noel was in the slot. To me, that opens up a massive ceiling for Sewell because remember, it was only a few short seasons ago when we saw Xavier Hutchinson as a feature wide receiver on this offense, true number one guy. And in those 12 games, he saw 161 targets, 107 receptions, 1,171 yards, and 6 touchdowns, putting him in the top 12 CFF wide receivers on that season, right? And the other thing that kind of surprised me was okay, well, Hutchinson went on to the NFL. He must have been some great athlete and everything that, Iowa State was just feeding. According to our star metric or our star rating, not so much. I mean, Higgins was an absolute athletic freak, 0.922 in our star rating. But Chase Sewell is at a, 0.6, I can't read that tiny, 0.659. And I was okay, so that's a bit of a dip right there. But Xavier Hutchinson, 0.414. So you're not even talking about needing to be some athletic freak for them to want to feed him. If Sewell is just clearly their number one guy, which I think there's a decent shot at that being, we could see a massive ceiling here. That's why I'm okay with him being drafted decently high compared to a lot of guys that are normally, or compared to a lot of G5 to Power 4 transfers. What do you think, Austin? Am I taking crazy pills here?
No, and I think one of the ones that we'll disagree on, I actually like Sewell and Xavier Townsend there as almost perfect replacements for the guys that left in Noel and Higgins. I agree with you, that for them to go and pluck guys like Higgins out of weird places over the past couple of years and still have them produce, because I am with you. I'm not a big G5 to P4 guy, especially at wide receiver. Running back, I'm a little more okay with it on average. I am actually not that worried about it. And this is going to be the one, maybe we'll get to the end of the year, maybe we should have been, maybe he'll be terrible, but it doesn't bother me at all. I see upwards of 100 targets for him and Townsend, because I think the running game there is not quite what it's been, at least in terms of having a guy that can kind of carry that side of things. So yeah, I like both of them quite a bit this year.
I think it helps a lot that Rocco Beck came back as well, because if we were looking at a situation where they're having to replace, the top 2 wide receivers and the quarterback, then I'd be yeah, I'm out on Iowa State's passing game this year. I'm not worried about trying to find that guy there this year. It seems like they got a lot to figure out, but they have Beck. Like you said, they go and grab two guys that theoretically should just directly replace what Higgins and Noel were able to do last year. They'll know exactly what to do with those guys. I think it'll translate pretty well in year one for these guys.
Agreed.
Austin, you want to discuss really the last two guys in this range. You want to discuss Ryan Wingo out of Texas and Carnell Tate out of Ohio State. So let's start with Wingo. What are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I don't like either of these guys at this kind of price point. So I was too low on Wingo coming out of high school. And with the capability that we have, we try to chart some of these wide receivers and basically figure out how efficient they were in high school. And Wingo was like one of the least efficient wide receivers we ever watched. So we were like, right off the bat, we were like, well, a little cautious on him. And then obviously last year he produced, fairly well for, the wide receiver 3-4, whatever they kind of cycled him in at times on this Texas roster. But they were doing a lot of things with him that would basically like easy touches, scheming him open, either sending him deep because he's just real big and real fast, or putting him like, crossers across the field where he can kind of build up that momentum. It's really tough to keep up with them, and then you can get the ball in his hands. And, obviously at that point, it's tough to stop a guy that's, 6'2", 210 or whatever, running at full speed across the middle of the field with the ball. My worry for Wingo is that is what he is. And with the high school profile in mind and how they used him last year, I'm curious if they think that's what he is right now too. And I'm a little hesitant to think that they're going to stick him into like the golden role from the end of last year, like what they did with Xavier Worthy. Although there was a lot of manufactured stuff for Worthy as well. I think Worthy's probably just a better player. So that's concern number one for me. Concern number two, I think the wide receiver talent in this room is fairly flat. So I think projecting one significantly ahead of any of the others is a little risky. For my money, I actually kind of like DeAndre Moore this year as the leading wide receiver, but I don't think he's going to go out there and have 1,200 yards and 12 touchdowns or anything. I think it'll be pretty compact in terms of production amongst the group. They've also got Emmett Mosley. They've got Jack Endries that comes in at tight end, who I think is a really particularly good player as well at tight end. And I think the running back room is real packed as well. And I do think there's some scenarios this year where because the defense is supposed to be pretty good, kind of play that complementary, take the air out of the ball football for large swaths of games because they're just better than whoever's lined up across from them and because they can. Mm-hmm. Between Wisner, Gibson, Clark, Baxter, whatever other running back you want to punch in there, I think they've got quite the deep stable. So putting Wingo at 23 just feels a little rich for me personally.
I mean, I agree somewhat. I've got him at wide receiver 29 for my CFF rankings. And really the thing that this is a great chance for me to highlight what I was kind of talking about at the beginning of the show, where when you do projections for all these guys, the ranking makes it look like there's a mile gap between them. But when you project it out, it's really not that big of a difference, right? So I took my 3 wide receivers at Texas this year that I expect to start, right? Wingo, Emmett Mosley, and DeAndre Moore. I'm projecting Wingo for about 85 targets, 52 receptions, 802 yards, 7 to 8 touchdowns. Emmett Mosley, who's my wide receiver 84, so you're talking 55 spots lower. I have him at 60 receptions, 741 yards, and about 6-7 touchdowns. So 60 yards difference between those two, maybe a touchdown difference. Like there's not a huge gap between guys just in this range. Like once you're at this point, you're very quickly getting into the range of the ceiling of guys at wide receiver 100 and the median of guys in wide receiver 30 are likely right there next to each other, right? So again, why Wingo above all the others? I would say, one, I kind of trust him over a guy like Mosley who's coming in after the spring. So I do have Mosley at a slightly higher confidence discount than I do for Wingo. And then Moore, again, I projected him at the slot, not as wide receiver 1 for Texas, but at the slot. And unfortunately, that just doesn't get him very high. 49 receptions, 578 yards, 5 touchdowns. Not really great. But Yeah, Wingo, I think that, like you said, they manufactured a lot of touches for him. That's usually a pretty good sign, especially as a young guy, that they're going to want to use him in a lot of creative ways. Let's see what they can do with him with a full offseason. I think still that Wingo has the highest ceiling of the bunch. Do I think he's Xavier Worthy? Probably not. But do I think he can kind of get those opportunities? Absolutely. What about Carnell Tate here? What do you want to discuss here, Austin?
24. So I get the argument for this is the Ohio State offense that has traditionally put up, at least since Ryan Day has been there with his fingerprints all over whatever. Awesome wide receiver seasons across the board. Most seasons, it's at least two guys that are pretty major contributors for them. I totally get it. I think my counterpoint would be that I think part of that has been the fact that these dudes have all been first round draft picks, essentially.
Yeah.
Going back the past few years, like basically all of them. And all of them, for the most part, have been awesome in the NFL. And I think Tate is not nearly the quality of player as they've had kind of as their wide receiver too, whether that's like Buka, Garrett Wilson, or Olave, whichever one of them you wanted to consider the two. Smith last year, I think, was like nominally the two in terms of how they ruled him out there, even though, from a production standpoint was the one. So Tate, for me, just having watched him a lot over the past few years, is the weakest of that group by quite a bit. And I think the gulf between him and whoever the wide receiver 3 is there, whether it's Ennis, whether it's Mylan Graham, who seems to be getting some hype, I'll believe that when I see it, whether it's true freshman Quincy Porter, we can shuffle some guys in and out of this and discuss whichever one you want. But I don't think there's that much of a talent gap between Tate and those guys. And so then you start to get into the chicken or egg. Like, is it the offense? Is it the player? I tend a lot of the time to think that it is more talent based than necessarily we kind of sometimes want to think. So that's a big part of it. And then the other part of it for me, I know they lost their quarterback and the entire stable of running backs last year, but I'm real skeptical on Sayin until I see it in person in a real game and he actually looks good. Mm-hmm. Because anything that we've seen publicly over the past couple of years has not been good out of Sayin at OSU. So I think that might limit the wide receiver 2's production in this offense, in addition to the fact that I don't think Tate's quite as talented as some of the guys they've had there recently. And I do think that the running backs are good enough that if they do end up having to lean on them a little harder this year, I think that I think Peoples is good. And I think, whoever else you want to talk about there, Jackson, Donaldson, whoever is like competent. So I think all those things add up. Like, could you convince me Tate's like wide receiver 36, 38? Yeah, sure. I could see that. 24 is just real rich for me. That feels like his absolute ceiling.
Funny you should say that wide receiver 36, 38, because I got him at wide receiver 30.
I saw that as I said it. I was like, okay, so yeah, that's about the range.
That's where I personally have him. I definitely have him a little bit lower compared to our consensus here. But unlike you, Austin, I kind of understand why people do have him so high. It really depends on how you're treating him. One, I think the talent question, is somewhat answered already. I mean, the dude lost his black stripe pretty early on when he arrived to Ohio State. The staff clearly seems to like him quite a bit. They rolled him out early, even like much more than guys like, Brandon Ennis or Mylan Graham that came in afterwards. Like, this staff will make it very clear. If they think you deserve time on the field, you'll get your time on the field. And that's what exactly Tate got. Same with the question of Julian Sayin. I feel like if the staff wasn't very confident in Julian Sayin, they're freaking Ohio State. They could have grabbed the best quarterback out of the portal if they wanted to, but instead they're sticking with Sayin. So I think that kind of speaks to the confidence there a little bit.
Who was the best quarterback in the portal this year?
Would you take Sayin or Mendoza at Ohio State?
I think Mendoza is probably better, but depending on what the cash commitment there would have been, I could see it being in their view close enough to not need to go there.
Mm-hmm. Do you think if Ohio, I know obviously John Vatier was like, dead set on going to Oklahoma, right? But like, if you think Ohio State had a chance to get John Vatier, do you think they would have?
No, I don't think he fits what they want to do.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well, but
I didn't think Will Howard necessarily did either, but I think Howard is closer to what they want to do. So,
but again, like I think that there's a vote of confidence in the staff. They didn't even try to go out and grab one of these guys, right? Like there was never really any talk of Ohio State going and grabbing or being in the mix for any of these top end quarterbacks, right? But anyway, back to my point on Tate. Really, how you treat him in terms of projection here, I think, kind of determines where you kind of fall with him. Because are you treating him as the second outside wide receiver? Are you projecting him as that, or are you projecting him as the second wide receiver? Period for Ohio State. Because the last few seasons, we've seen a nice little split between the slot receiver has been the top two, and then one of the outside guys has been, those are your top two guys for Ohio State's receiving stats. Granted, as you kind of mentioned, Austin, the run of slot receivers that Ohio State's had over the last several years has just been incredible. Garrett Wilson, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Emeka Egbuka, when you got those guys in your slot, they're going to end up in your top two receivers, right? This is the first season where I think in a while that we're coming into the season and we can agree that the top two outside guys are set and probably the best receiving options on this roster, while the major questions rely in the slot. Like Ohio State's best options there right now are Brandon Inniss, Bryson Rogers, two guys I don't think anybody's really that high on. Again, Austin, you might be able to speak to that. I don't know how those guys are, being ranked over at Campus to Canton. Okay, not very high for those of you in the podcast. Austin's throwing the slash across the throat for that. But yeah, so if you give Tate the number two outside wide receiver targets over the last couple of seasons, you're projecting him for like 45, 50 targets, which is what he got last year, roughly. And that's disgusting for CFF purposes, right? You don't want a wide receiver that's going to get 45, 50 targets. But if you give him wide receiver 2 numbers for Ohio State, now you're looking at 85, 90 targets, right? My projection has him at 75 targets. So not quite directly in the middle of those two outcomes, but definitely not at the ceiling either. If I bumped him up to that 85 target range, you are looking at a top 15 wide receiver in my projection. So I understand why people are kind of pretty high on him, even though personally I'm a little bit further back. But here's also the thing I look at. I look at his stat lines from last year. Austin, I've got it up on the show sheet here. Where is the single game stat line that really kind of screams this guy can be a weekly contributor for wide receiver in CFF? Right? Because I look at all these games, there's never a truly complete game. Like, he has a 100-yard game against Nebraska, but he had 4 targets in that game. Right? So great. He's super efficient in the one game. But I needed to see a game where he's got high targets, high production, gets touchdowns along with that, and there just isn't a game like that in his entire resume last year, despite the fact that he was starting the whole year. So that definitely makes me a little concerned for Tate. So I agree with you that I think people need to calm down on Tate just a little bit, but I also kind of understand why people are so high on him.
He's getting that OSU wide receiver bump, and I guess we just haven't seen quite that out of him yet. So, yeah. Makes it tough.
If you had to take a shot, because I know people ask at the slot position, Austin, who would you want to take there?
I mean, I think their intention is to have Inniss doing it. That's all I've got. I mean, I don't know that I know that they were really high on Graham last year, but Graham did nothing.
He's also big. He's not a guy that you can really stick in the slot.
No, I think he's like Zay Flowers, like in terms of skill set. I think you could put him there if he needed to be there. He might be a little bigger than Flowers, but like that's essentially the kind of player that he is stylistically.
Okay, that's interesting then, because he was getting a lot of buzz in the spring. Yeah, 6'1", 185. I was thinking he was north of 200, so I was like, that's a pretty big slot.
It's because it's interesting because they're playing Inniss in the slot, and I think of Inniss as more of like a downfield guy, like overall. And then obviously, you've got like true freshman Quincy Porter. I think he's more of a boundary guy, like a possession-ish type player. Honestly, I think a little closer to Carnell Tate stylistically. So like he doesn't make a lot of sense to put in the slot for me. I do think it comes down to Graham or Inniss, and I do think it's going to end up being Inniss at least to start the year. And we'll see how that goes from there. I don't know.
All righty. Let's hit our last 12 wide receivers here. At wide receiver 25, we got Ian Strong out of Rutgers. Number 26, Aaron Anderson out of LSU. Number 27, we got Hudson Clement out of Illinois, formerly of West Virginia. Number 28, we got Yannick Smith. I can't remember exactly which way it goes. Wide receiver out of East Carolina. At number 29, we have Kevin Coleman out of Missouri, formerly of Mississippi State. Number 30, we have Jacoby Lane out of USC. At number 31, we have Landon Sides out of North Texas. At number 32, we got Pefele Ashlock out of Hawaii. Number 33, Devin Voisin out of South Alabama. At number 34, we have Joseph Williams out of Colorado, formerly of Tulsa. At number 35, we have our first true freshman of our rankings here with DeCorian Moore out of Oregon. At number 36, we have Colin Lacey out of Louisville. Austin, let's get to your two guys here you want to discuss here. And you want to take a look at Joseph Williams out of Colorado, again, formerly of Tulsa, and then DeCorian Moore, our freshman, our only freshman to make it into our top 36 rankings of really any position. So that'll be an interesting one to discuss there. Let's start with Williams, though, at Colorado. What are your thoughts on him?
Colorado is such a wild card offense this year. And stop me if you've heard that before. But for real, they're replacing so much. And I think it's a very unique circumstance because I think you have to ask yourself with their quarterback's dad as the coach, how much of the game plan was made with that in mind. I'm not going to give an answer to that one way or the other, but I think you have to at least think about it and how this roster has been constructed over the past couple of years. You lose that quarterback, you lose your top multiple receivers, Wester, Horn, and Hunter, all gone. You're replacing them with, I think, comparably across the board talented players. I don't think anybody thinks that Horn or Wester or anything were like amazing, and obviously Hunter's Hunter. But you're replacing, I think the big variable is you're replacing a quarterback with a player that's nothing like the quarterback you had in there before. And so is this roster equipped to adapt to that, or are they just going to try to do square peg round hole, or are they going to I think there's a lot of different ways that you can go with this offense here. I don't think the offense is going to bottom out by any stretch of the imagination this year, but I am just really curious as to what the preferred go-to avenue is going to be through the air. And I don't think of Kaden Salter personally as like an amazing downfield passer overall. I think of him a little more as a dump off guy and, a guy that's going to scramble around and make plays with his legs. And for Williams, especially as a G or as a P4 to G5 to P4 guy, which we already mentioned earlier, we're both a little hesitant on at times to come in here with some other pretty talented players and be the guy in an offense that I have some questions as to what this attack is going to look like. I'm not that in on Williams this year. If I had to pick a wide receiver that I think is going to lead them, I do think it's Draylon Miller just based on sheer volume, but I don't feel amazing about that. And the other part and why I kind of like Miller a little more is that I think if they replace Salter, because they're kind of playing this weird game this offseason where they're also really highlighting the freshman Juju Lewis, who's, kind of the incumbent waiting in the wings quarterback. As an inexperienced quarterback who, like the line I'm real sketchy on, I think if something happens and he's in there, he's also going to be looking in, short, intermediate type stuff. So I think Draylon's the more reliable guy. Again, not a super high ceiling on any of these guys. I wouldn't put any of them this high personally. But I am not a big Joseph Williams guy this year.
Yeah, I do have Williams ranked pretty high. I might be the guy actually dragging him up into our rankings. I've got him at wide receiver 20, mostly because I do think that they're going to be able to replicate what they did somewhat last year. But also, again, let me be very clear. I'm not expecting 120 targets to go Williams' way here, but I could see 85 targets, and that's pretty good in terms of like a ceiling for him there. Because again, like you're looking at the system, granted the reception percentage is definitely boosted by the fact that you had an uber talented guy like Hunter driving that up that caught everything that came his way. But even still, like I've got Williams projected for 85 targets, 55, 56 catches, 887 yards, 8.5 touchdowns. So, 8 to 9 touchdowns in that range. I think it's pretty reasonable for a wide receiver one on this offense. And as you kind of mentioned before, it's really down to three guys for this offense. Amari Miller, Draylon Miller, and Joseph Williams. Why is Williams kind of getting all the love compared to everybody else? And I think the main thing is that Williams is kind of seen as the most multiple of these three options, right? Miller, big play, deep threat. That's what he does, right? Like he's going to get the 20 yards per catch. But really, that's all we've seen him do. So do they kind of keep him in that role? I think that Amari Miller actually has the highest ceiling of this bunch because if he can grow beyond that, and he has that potential to hit those, 50, 60, 70-yard plays on the outside there, I think he's got the highest upside of this bunch. But so you got Amari Miller doing that. Meanwhile, Draylon Miller is like the direct opposite. He plays in the slot. He's got short ADOT, very reliable option underneath, but last year he averaged about 8.7 yards per catch. So you're not getting super high value targets with Draylon Miller there. Meanwhile, Williams is kind of that healthy in-between option, right? He's not like a major deep threat, although he did almost average about 20 yards per catch last year, and his ADOT was super high with Tulsa. So that obviously helps him out a little bit there, kind of gives him a little bit higher ceiling. But I think he can run a lot of those shorter routes that maybe Amari Miller isn't as great at. And so I think people are kind of leaning into that. The buzz from spring camp was definitely around Joseph Williams in terms of how well he was performing there. So those are kind of some of the things why people are kind of a little bit higher on Williams compared to others. But as you kind of mentioned before, a lot of this comes down to what does Kaidon Salter or Julian Lewis do under center, right? Are they going to pass the ball enough for any of these guys to be relevant? And the last time we saw Kaidon Salter produce a CFF wide receiver in CJ Daniels, he fit more of Amari Miller's mold, right? Just straight downfield, hyper efficient targets, right? Not really targeting the intermediate to short game as much in terms of like funnel feeding one target. So I agree with you. Colorado's very much an enigma this year. I have Joseph Williams at wide receiver 20. I don't feel great about that. But I also don't feel like I can really bump him down too much in terms of my projection, and that's just where his projection lands him for me.
Fair enough.
So, what about DeCorian Moore out of Oregon? What are your thoughts there?
I love DeCorian Moore this year. I think he's very clearly the wide receiver one there at Oregon. I thought that already might be the case, and then Evan Stewart went down, and I think there's just nothing else there. They've actually not really recruited the wide receiver position that well over the past few cycles. The one guy that they did bring in that was real highly ranked that everyone kind of liked is Jurion Dickey, and he's just had knee issues. And I think, at this point, I don't think he's quite the same player as he was coming out of high school. And then you've got like cast-offs like Gary Bryant Jr., Malik Benson. You've got Justice Lowe, who I think is a fine wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 kind of guy, but really not a guy that I would expect to be able to lead a room. I do think the one variable here is going to be Dante Moore. What does he look like? But I think there has to be at least a little bit of confidence in this staff in kind of taking in these quarterbacks who weren't at all-time highs in terms of their perceived value and perceived play by any sense of the imagination, and really kind of gotten the most out of them. I don't think the offense is going to be necessarily as prolific on the whole passing the ball. I think I've said this especially since Evan Stewart went down. I think this is a year where we might see them run the ball quite a bit. They've got, again, another one of these schools that has a stable of running backs that they can't seem to stop talking about. And, how much of it is coach speak, how much of it isn't. But, they bring in Hughes. They've got Noah Whittington is kind of a third down guy. They've got Jaden Lamar. They've got Ruggs. They've got Jordan Davison they brought in this year. They seem to like all these guys to some extent. So I do think this offense will still be prolific enough to produce one guy. And I think Moore is going to have, I would not put him in the Jeremiah Smith class last year, but let's talk maybe Ryan Williams without the total face plant in the second half of the year. Feels maybe closer in line to what we might get out of Moore this year, which would put him right around this range overall.
Trying to find him in my project. There he is. Yeah, I got him projected for wide receiver 41, so I'm actually a little bit lower than what our consensus is. That seems to be a theme tonight. Maybe I'm just really high on certain guys that make no sense. But I've got him looking at about 87 targets, finishing about 62 catches. Again, potentially as high as 961 yards and 9 touchdowns. Now, I've got a decent confidence discount on him, because, again, it is a true freshman season. The numbers I'm using for his projections aren't Moore's. They're the systems almost entirely, because what the heck else am I going to base a guy that hasn't touched the field for college yet? And because of that, that really inflates his projection for me. So I put the confidence discount pretty high for him. Puts him at wide receiver 41. I think he absolutely could finish as, again, like you said, he could be this year's, somewhere between where Jeremiah Smith finished last year, where Jeremiah Smith was a top 12 wide receiver for CFF, and Ryan Williams was top 32. Decory Moore absolutely could finish right around in that, wide receiver 20, 25-ish range, and that wouldn't shock me at all. And I also agree with you. The big question here is Dante Moore. Oregon, I think people forget, like, Oregon has been so spoiled the last 3 years with extremely veteran college quarterbacks coming into a very QB-friendly system there. Moore's far less experienced than those guys ever were, and really the last time we saw him starting full-time at UCLA, it just wasn't that great. Now, granted, he's sat a year. He's done what he should have done from the beginning and just sat a year or two, learn the playbook, and let's go out and have one great season that can propel you to the NFL. I'm hoping that he's learned his lesson, and I wish nothing but the best for Moore, but I do think that if there's something that's going to hold back Decory Moore and just this entire passing game in general, yes, I'm talking to you guys, the Sadiq, Kenyon Sadiq fans out there. Like, if there's something that's going to hold back this passing game, Moore is a very big question mark. So let's talk about my guys I want to discuss in this range. I want to talk about Yannick Smith out of East Carolina. I really should have picked a guy that I actually know how to pronounce the name of, so I don't make a fool out of myself.
More fun this way.
And then I want to talk about Landon Sides out of North Texas. I'll do Yannick Smith here pretty quickly. This is another chance, just like Ryan Wingo, for me to really highlight just how little of a gap there is, despite the fact that rankings make it seem like there's a huge gap. Because the CFF community seems pretty ready to crown Yannick after Chase Sowell left ECU. And once again, I kind of get it. But I am also still the lowest of Yannick out of our group. But I don't necessarily blame people, right? Like, Smith looked great as a true freshman last year. 16.7 yards per catch, 16 targets over his last 4 games when Chase Sewell got hobbled. I'd say that Yannick definitely, of all the wide receivers in this room, has the ceiling in this offense, and why I have him ranked ahead of the likes of Anthony Smith and Jacquez Petaway. But when I look at the projections here, Yannick Smith, I have projected at 78 targets, which gets to 48 receptions, 845 yards, 7 to 8 touchdowns. That's wide receiver 36 in terms of projections for me. Meanwhile, Anthony Smith, 80 targets. I actually have him with more targets. 43 receptions, 805 yards, 7 to 8 touchdowns. 40 yards difference between those two guys, and you are talking about almost a 40-spot difference in the rankings. Like, this is just another chance for me to really say wait on wide receiver, right? Like, if Yannick is going wide receiver 43 in drafts, which he's going later than like our projections have him at, like, and Anthony Smith is going wide receiver 62, just take the second option. Like, again, I think you really can find some really good options later at wide receiver. And a lot of the guys that are really like, that seem really high up in rankings, like, the rankings don't do justice just how close or how uncertain everything is in that mid-tier range of wide receivers this
year. No, I completely agree. That whole ECU offense, I think, is a little undervalued. I like Yannick. I like Anthony. I like both those guys. I've been calling them the Smith Bros. I don't think they're related, but
they're not.
It's
like the Miller brothers at Colorado. I've exactly said Miller brothers, and I've actually I confused poor Joe Arpazi for a couple months because I said that on his show, and he thought they were actual brothers for a long time, and I'm like, oh no, I didn't mean to do that.
It's just more fun this way.
Oh no, for sure. But yeah, like, again, both those guys are great picks, but again, it's one of those places where you take a look at the ADP. I don't think there's a huge difference between the two of them. The other wide receiver I want to discuss in this range is Landon Sides out of North Texas. Some of you might be pretty shocked to see Sides here over, the likes of Miles Coleman. And I'll get to Miles Coleman later, but right now I'll focus on Sides. Last year, you might be looking at what DT Sheffield did in his great year and wonder why we wouldn't want to target the guy potentially set to take over that slot role. And I'm here to tell you guys that was such an anomaly for the slot wide receiver to be the wide receiver 1 for this offense. Just look at the history of Eric Morris's offense. He loves his outside wide receivers. 2023, Ja'Cory Macklin, 100 targets, 57 receptions, 1,000 yards, 11 touchdowns. 2022, Dejon Stribling, 79 targets, 51 receptions, 602 yards, 5 touchdowns, led Washington State that year. 2021, back at Incarnate Word, Taylor Grimes, 120 targets, 91 receptions, 1,205 yards, 16 touchdowns. In 2020, in 6 games, you saw Darian Chafin get 52 targets, 375 yards, and 4 touchdowns. So extrapolate that to 12 games, you're looking at another 100 target season. He loves his outside guys. And I wish I could get 2019 and earlier stats just to continue to prove my point even further. Even then, look at 2024. Even with DT Sheffield getting 95 regular season targets, which is already a huge anomaly for this offense in general, you would think that would be like the ultimate trend buster, right? I'm going to tell you wrong. It was done out of necessity, right? Because in week 1, who was it that had 15 targets, 12 receptions, 230 yards, and 2 touchdowns? Austin, you know the answer to that question?
Is it Landon Sides?
It was not Landon Sides. It was Damon Ward, though, the outside wide receiver. It was not DT Sheffield. Then Ward got injured. They tried to play him for some reason, but after week 1, he clearly wasn't himself. So Sheffield then got the targets. They didn't really have another option on the outside there they could really trust at that point in time. But then Ward comes back. And what happened when Ward was back full-time starting after their second bye week? Ward, despite being god-awful, was the one being force-fed targets, and Sheffield's value tanked, as people who rostered him last year know very well in the last 4 games of the season. In those last 4 games of the season, Damon Ward, once again, despite him having a near 20% drop rate, out-targeted Sheffield in every single game. And once again, it proves that when Morris has himself an outside guy that he likes, that is who he targets, right? The word is that Landon Sides is moving to the outside this year, and that has been called, and he's been called the primary target outside by a couple of beat reporters out of North Texas. Sides performed well as a true freshman, took a bit of a step back last year after some injuries, but he'll be back this year, sounds fully healthy. He will be the system play for this offense, not Coleman. People will look at Coleman's bowl game, but they look at Coleman's bowl game, but completely ignore Landon Sides, who finished that game with 8 targets, 5 receptions, 89 yards, and a touchdown, which is just 1 target less than Coleman, 1 reception less than Coleman, and about 15 yards less than Coleman. Both of them got a touchdown. Sides is the guy I think you need to target in this offense, not Coleman. We'll get to Coleman later. I got more to say on him, but Austin, your thoughts on Sides?
I have been cautious on Coleman. So not necessarily like bullish on Sides, just, like I don't know that it's Coleman and I think I want a guy here. So I'm with you. I follow where you're going here. And just as a side note, because this is how I do my analysis most of the time, my main team in CFP 25 was North Texas, and Sides always turned into a real great player for me. So, if we're going to toss that in there as well, I think I have to.
I mean, if we're going by CFP 26,
I haven't played CFP 26 yet. So in fairness,
I did the 10-hour free trial. I haven't had the money to put together to buy CFP 26 yet, because I'm trying to decide between that and Helldivers is coming to Xbox next month. So I'm like, well, I only got money to really buy one of those games. So which one am I going to do? I know that makes me a bad college football fan, but like, I can just play 25.
I haven't purchased any yet. Wait, Jared, you say you don't have time now. Wait till you start having kids, man.
Hey man, that's like 5 years down the line. I'm good on that front for a while. Anyway, what was I saying? I was going to say, if we're using CFP 2025 logic, then Coleman Bennett at Kennesaw State's about to go for a Heisman season this year. As far as my dynasty's concerned. All right, so that's our top 36 wide receivers. Let's get negative here for a second here, Austin. Let's go talk about some wide receivers that we think are going too high in drafts. Again, you've already kind of discussed a lot of guys that you were kind of questioning the rankings of and everything, but now let's really hit some of these guys that are going too high in drafts. So we'll start with my first guy here, and that is Pefele Ashlock out of Hawaii. He's currently going as wide receiver 13 in ADP. I've got him ranked as wide receiver 37. And again, ADP-wise, wide receiver 13 puts him around the early 5th round range. And like everybody else, and I think where a lot of people still are, I was ready to have Ashlock exactly where he's going in drafts. I was thinking, just vibes only, top 10, 15-ish wide receiver, right? The volume's there. But then I really started to kind of look at the last 2 years. Again, the volume is elite. 100-plus targets in each of the last 2 years, 120 targets in 2023. He had 104 targets last year in 11 games, so you're probably looking at, 114 over 12 games right there. Excuse me. But boy, for a slot receiver, Ashlock sure has a real low catch rate. Like last year, he was sub 60% in catch rate, which you really normally see for, your high ADOT outside wide receivers. But Ashlock's the opposite, low ADOT, sub 10 yards, and he's coming out of the slot. You expect those guys to have a bit higher of a catch rate, right? You want to see those high targets turn into high reception percentages, especially for like PPR purposes, right? But he just couldn't hang on to the ball. He had a 17.6% drop rate last season, one of the worst among FBS wide receivers with 50 or more targets. Now, in addition to me just questioning whether or not Ashlock's actually a good wide receiver or not, he has legitimate competition at his own position. Like Nick Senecal emerged as a very viable alternative option to Ashlock in the slot. Now, granted, they'll both be out there. They run 4 wide receivers sets all the time. So this isn't me being like, oh, Senecal is going to, replace Ashlock snaps or anything. But we saw as the offense, was going in the second half of the season, Senecal was earning the eyes of the quarterback almost as often as Ashlock does. And while Senecal didn't really outperform Ashlock by much in the efficiency department, he was a great improvement in that one area, drop. Senecal only had a drop percentage of about 6%, almost a third of what Ashlock was handling, right? I think there's a legit chance that Senecal takes over as the preferred option in the slot over Ashlock if Ashlock really doesn't get that drop issue under control. And then much like the next wide receiver I'll talk about as well, even if I give Ashlock the complete benefit of the doubt on targets, right? And I think he's getting his 120 targets again this year. The projections just still isn't great. 78 receptions, 780 yards, and 7 touchdowns, which isn't, bad, but, it's not going to be a guy that I'm going to put in my top 10, top 15 wide receivers for the year. Very much a guy that belongs in that, wide receiver 30, 40 range, right? And that's the kind of projection you'll get when all you can produce is 10 yards a catch for 2 years straight. So I'm pretty out on Ashlock at his current price. Again, I got him much lower than ADP has him. I don't think I've gotten a single share of him so far this offseason. What do you think of him, Austin?
I don't want to say I'm out on Ashlock, but I am very in on Senecal. I just pulled up real quick. I went to our handy dandy roster management tool, which also shows you your rostership across your leagues. And Senecal is my second most rostered wide receiver, tied. But I have drafted him in a very large portion of drafts this offseason. I think that the gap, even if Ashlock is kind of their wide receiver one, I think it'll be a lot closer than people think. And so the investment for me is to take Senecal, 5, 10, 15 rounds later than a guy like Ashlock would go. It makes just too much sense to me. But I do believe in Alejado. I do believe in this offense. I think that they're going to chuck the ball around a ton. Mm-hmm. So I'm a little higher. I don't think you can necessarily go wrong with either, but depending on price point, but Senecal to me is just much easier to stomach. A big Senecal guy this year. Yeah.
All right, let's talk about your first wide receiver you think is being drafted too high. Eugene Wilson out of Florida. On one hand, Austin, as a Georgia fan, I'm ready to crap on a Florida player here, but also, I ain't gonna lie, he's pretty high in my rankings, so this will be a fun little disagreement here.
I have some questions about how this Florida offense is going to operate this year, similar to Colorado, but less in the sense because it's not like there's a ton of personnel changes, at least at some of the more important spots across the offense. I just suspect that DJ Lagway is going to run a little bit more than he did last year. And not that they were super high volume passing when he was in there anyway, but I mean, the last 4 games of the season, 26 attempts, 18, 22, 35, like those are higher attempt numbers. I think he'd be closer to the 26 or fewer in most games, especially because Billy Napier over the course of his coaching career has tended to be more of a run heavy guy. And I think he does have the running back stable to at least approach that approach more than maybe they had there last year, either due to experience or injury. I mean, if you look at Napier, I mean, just his time at Florida, his most prolific wide receiver in terms of receptions was Pearsall a couple years ago. That kind of came out of nowhere, and I think was more due to the fact that Graham Mertz is basically the complete opposite of a passer as DJ Lagway is in terms of a little more of a conservative, don't make a lot of mistakes kind of guy, whereas Lagway's a push the ball down the field, explosive plays, create some stuff with his legs, a little bit more out of structure kind of guy. And while I do think that Wilson was fine last year with him there, I don't think that he's necessarily the guy in this offense that fits that kind of usage, at least, perfectly. So I'm not saying that he's going to have a bad season. I just think he's going a little earlier than I would want. And I really probably, if I was playing a pure CFF league, I really probably wouldn't be drafting any of these Florida wide receivers. Like it's not even, I don't think worth taking like one of these guys late as kind of a stash and you hope that there's some upside there. I just don't see that for this passing attack this year.
See, the thing I can't stop ignoring is the fact that we were told going into the season last year that they were going to make targeting Wilson a priority, and that's exactly what they did. He got 8+ targets in three of his four games he played last season when he was healthy. If I take out the 2-target game because that is where he got hurt, right?
Yeah.
So if you just look at those, again, it's small sample size, I fully admit, but again, like if that's what their plan was to get him about 8 chances a game, that's good for about 90 to 95 targets over the course of the regular season, right? He has had an elite catch percentage, right, so far in college. 82.5% of his targets being completed. Fantastic for PPR purposes. So already just in that format, I think he gets a pretty big bump just because of that. And one of the big things with Wilson was that, especially in his freshman year, very inefficient, right? But like you mentioned, Austin, with DJ Lagway at quarterback, Napier seems he's a lot more likely to actually push the ball down the field. And especially in the slot, we saw a huge change there, right? Because last year, Chimere Dike had an ADOT of 14.6, and we saw his rise, his ADOT rise between these two quarterbacks. Like when Mertz was in the game, his passing ADOT was 7.6. When Lagway was in, he was at 12 for average depth of target. That's a huge jump, and that adds a lot more high-value targets for every single one of these wide receivers. And even with Eugene Wilson, granted, again, not the highest ADOT in the world we want to see, but he went from 2.8 under Mertz to 6 under Lagway. So that's a pretty solid jump right there. Now, I'm not expecting Wilson to be like DK was last year and get 19 yards a catch out of the slot. That's just not something I really expect him to do, and we haven't seen anything from Wilson that suggests that he can be that efficient all the time. But I do expect it to be a lot closer to his 14 yards per catch he saw in limited time last year than his 8.9 he saw in freshman year, right? So once I kind of take that into account, my projection includes both of Wilson's years and what DK was able to do last season. You take all that, add the 95 targets, assuming that, again, they kind of force feed him again like they started to last year. That gets him to 73 receptions, 940 yards, 8 to 9 touchdowns. That's a pretty dang good line for CFF purposes. And if I just include Eugene Wilson's stuff and I take Chimere Dike out of it, you're still looking at 69 receptions, 966 yards, and 9 touchdowns. I don't know if he can fully get to that, but I think he's a lot safer bet than people are willing to get him to play him at. Who else are they going to target in that passing game? Right? They bring in J. Michael Sturdivant. I know Mike is going nuts right now about that, but Aiden Mizell, like if Wilson's healthy, he is the receiving game for this offense. They don't really have a tight end that I think they can really rely on. Like Jaden Baugh might catch balls out of the backfield, but Wilson is a pretty safe bet, I would say. Like maybe I come down on him a little bit because, again, wide receiver 11 in my rankings does feel a little crazy. But I think you have most of what you want here for CFF. Like, you got a clear wide receiver 1. Like I said, not really much competition. A very talented quarterback that will want to push the ball down the field. I think some people are kind of underrating him a little bit.
Just think if you're looking for a safe guy, I don't know. I think there's better options. Lewis Bond, that are much later. I think there's going to be quite a few of those guys this year.
We'll see. All right, let's go to Miles Coleman here. This is where I get to tear into this man, and I feel bad because I don't have any ill will actually towards Miles Coleman. I think he's a very fun story, but boy, I can't handle him at wide receiver 38 in drafts right now. Late 9th round. I've got him wide receiver 72, and like I said, I already gave my spiel on why Sides is the better and safer play for North Texas this year, but let's really dive into Miles Coleman now. People love to look at what he did in the bowl game, where Coleman, again, put 6 receptions, 104 yards, and a touchdown on 9 targets. Simply put, that was an anomaly. Like, that was so much of an anomaly, it was hard to put words into. Like, one, Coleman massively benefited from Makers starting at quarterback. They played in high school together. They already had a connection. There was a buddy system kind of going on there, right? We simply can't expect that to be the case, especially if Poffenbarger wins this job. 2, Coleman was crazy efficient in that game to the point where we only saw that once elsewhere in the season. Like, in the bowl game, Coleman had 17.3 yards per catch. He had more than 10 yards per catch in only 2 other games in the season, and one of those, he was at exactly 10. Otherwise, he was sub 10 yards per catch in every other game that he played in. His season-long average was 11 yards per catch, again, greatly inflated by that 17.3 yards per catch there in the bowl game. Regular season, he was under 10. Other reasons why I don't really like Coleman. 1, he's 5'6", 159 pounds. Yes, obviously those things don't matter as much at the G5 level or really in college in general, but I do think there are a limit to these things, right? That's a very small wide receiver that you're working on there. 2, I think he's got serious competition for those slot targets and snaps. Wyatt Young was very impressive as a true freshman last year out of the slot. They also bring in Simeon Evans from Sam Houston, who was a starting wide receiver for the Bearcats last year. I doubt he came in here to sit. And then in my projections, much like Pafele Ashlock, even if I give Coleman Sheffield's 90 targets and I don't give him any confidence discount whatsoever, so he's 100% what my projection gives him, he barely breaks 700 yards. There's just not much I like about Coleman this year. I think it would take a miracle for him to return the value that he's being drafted at in leagues right now. What do you think, Austin?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't disagree with any of that. I've long suspected that both the Colemans this offseason are benefiting a little too heavily from those bowl games last year. Coleman at San Jose State, obviously being the other one. So I have not really been targeting either. I've been targeting guys on both offenses that are a little further down the depth chart. So I think I might have taken one Coleman again because it's, 12 leagues or whatever I'm in. If you take them one place just to have them once, that's cool. But not a big target for me.
All right, Austin, the next guy you want to discuss here, we have listed as Chris Bell, but you initially put this on the sheet as like Chris Bell / Colin Lacey. So you're just down on Louisville wide receivers in general here. What are you thinking here?
I am a little bit. I think this might be a year where they just don't have a quote unquote the guy, capitalize the if you want to for emphasis. I think we might be steering a little closer to that. I think, Bell's been there. He's been there with Braum, and he's been leapfrogged by multiple players over the years as kind of the guy, which makes me a little nervous on Bell. Even though, at least from what Braum usually does, he seems like he should be the guy in theory that would be the beneficiary of Corey Brooks leaving just because he's more of a boundary guy. Mm-hmm. I think he can win downfield a little bit, do some things like that. Although, will he catch it when he gets there? That remains to be seen. We've seen some pretty egregious drops from him over the past couple of years. Lacey might have the talent or at least the past production to maybe hang a hat on, but he plays in the less preferred slot. We have seen slot guys work with Braum a little bit, but not always, and they've guys that I think generally been a little more talented than a guy like Lacey. So kind of start getting into that dynamic. They have a new quarterback, Miller Moss. I think Moss got a little bit of a raw deal at USC last year. I just think that he could not provide the role based on that offensive line and how Lincoln Riley has tended to kind of prefer his quarterbacks in terms of the out of structure stuff.
He definitely got scapegoated a little bit.
He couldn't do that as well as Maiev could. So I get, I think he's a little better than maybe people have in the back of their minds, but at the same time, I don't think he's a world beater by any means. And I don't think we can love the running backs here and the wide receivers here. I think this offense is not quite high ceiling enough for us to really love one or the other. And if we really like Isaac Brown and Watson to an extent as well, I think is going to get some touches. And I don't know how much I can love this passing attack on a weekly basis, at least with any sort of projectability. This might be a classic better and best ball kind of pick for either of these two wide receivers. And for Bell, specifically going at wide receiver 15, I just don't love that. I think there might be other offenses that I'm a little more willing to target than this one from a passing perspective.
I will. Okay, never mind. Actually, I was about to say I will disagree with you slightly on not being able to love Ja'Cory Brooks and or not the wide receiver and the running back at the same time, because I was looking and I saw Isaac Brown was a top 15 or top 18 running back second half of the season, and I was trying to look up what Ja'Cory Brooks was. Ja'Cory Brooks, wide receiver 22 on the season, but wide receiver 52 in the second half of the season. But granted, he got banged up a little bit as well, so like there's a bit of that, but I think that's a pretty good point there. And yeah, Jeff Braun wide receivers ones just aren't quite as elite when he does have clear running back ones to pair with them, right? Like I don't think with Chris Bell or Colin Lacey, whoever you like here, we're not going to get, the volume that Rondale Moore or David Bell or even Chuck Sizzle got, so long as they have, Isaac Brown and Duke Watson to tote the rock as well. Even still, though, I think that the Louisville wide receiver one is still one of the safest values out there, especially in a tumultuous wide receiver year where there's not a lot of like things you can really hang your hat on. Because like in the last 2 years, with Brom having an RB1, the wide receiver ones, which were Jamari Thrash and Ja'Cory Brooks, have seen 12-game target totals of 91 and 93. So not quite the elite volume we've seen, with guys before that, but still a very, very nice floor. And what Jeff Brom's able to do, whether it's a system or just the guys he pick out, they once again have that really nice combination of really solid catch percentage and really nice catch efficiency. Typically your outside wide receivers tend to be in the 50-55% catch radius or catch percentage range. Both Brooks and Jamari Thrash are kind of in that 65-70% catch range, which is where, like I said, which is where Brooks and Thrash have been. That's fantastic. With that, you don't need like 110 plus targets to be CFF relevant. I do think that Bell is that next guy on the outside. Yes, I know. Like you said, he's been leapfrogged a couple of times here. I can't really speak to that. What I can speak to is that Louisville paid a lot of money for him to stay, and they didn't go out and get anybody to be major competition for him on that outside role, right? This major competition is with Colin Lacey, who is in that slot. And as you kind of mentioned, the last time we saw Brom rely on a slot was Rondale Moore back in 2018. And even then, Lacey really just doesn't quite have the efficiency, at least during so far what he's shown at Louisville, to kind of reach the ceiling we'd want to see out of a wide receiver one for Louisville. He averaged 11.9 yards per catch last year. Meanwhile, Bell averaged 18.3 yards per catch last year, which was just mind-bogglingly great. Speaking of that efficiency combined with what Bell did the year before makes my projection for Bell pretty great. Like, I gave him the 95 targets that I'm kind of expecting for the top wide receiver for this offense to get. If he's bringing in about 2/3 of his balls and just under 16 yards per catch, that gets him to 1,000 yards. Like, I don't really see what the competition is for Bell this year outside of Lacey. And even Lacey, I have projected for 75 targets. I think that those two end up getting funneled quite a bit, but Bell really does still have the ceiling out of those two.
Yeah, and I hear that. I definitely think that there's a chance that I'm very wrong. I just, have been underwhelmed by the duo.
No, and I understand that. Again, the point of Bell being leapfrogged the last couple of years is definitely one that kind of sticks in the back of my mind of like why he's got everything in terms of like he should be the wide receiver one. He's got great stats, great efficiency, clearly can play pretty well. Like you said, he's got some egregious drops here and there, but for the most part, like he plays like the best wide receiver. It's just why isn't he getting those targets? We'll see. Let's move on to my third guy that I'm pretty down on this year, and that is Kevin Concepcion out of Texas A&M. ADP has him at wide receiver 69. I will say when I wrote him, this is before I updated our ADP, dude was going wide receiver 46 in June. So he's definitely come down a little bit in the last month. Guess what? Still ain't low enough for me. I got him wide receiver 151. Again, on a personal level, I'm hoping for a bounce-back season from Casey. I really liked him as a freshman. But I really think that freshman season where he finished top 20 for CFF was really such an anomaly, and people are really hanging their hats on that, right? He caught a lot of teams off guard that freshman year, and at times was the entire offense for NC State because they couldn't get really anything else going. You're not going to see that at Texas A&M. You're not going to see teams unprepared for a guy like Casey Concepcion, considering his tape is now out there. Two, Texas A&M has enough weapons to where they're not going to make Concepcion, they're not going to make him the volume play, right? Yeah, like after his freshman year with Kevin Concepcion, right? Like with a full offseason prepare for him, the ACC really kind of keyed in on him. He fell off hard, going from 7.9 yards per carry in the rushing department to 2.4. They were much more prepared for that. He went from 11.7 yards per catch to 8.7. It got really, really bad last year, as anybody who rostered him know. Then we take a look at the system here. Colin Klein really doesn't typically feature one guy. Best I could find was 80 targets, and even if that's the case for Concepcion, he's really just not efficient enough to make up for that lower volume, kind of like a guy like Chris Bell could, right? And it's not like you can really point to any slots in recent memory for Klein that you can say like, oh, well, Klein knows how to get them open and make them more efficient. Like, Casey has averaged 10.7 yards per catch over the last 2 years. Meanwhile, Klein's slots have barely done much better at 11 yards a pop. So I'm not like hanging my hat on the fact that, oh, Klein knows how to get a guy like Kevin Concepcion open and more efficient. So yeah, Casey will get his. He'll get plenty of rushing and gadget plays, but I don't think that'll be enough to kind of make up for things. At the end of the day, he's being drafted for his name, for what he did his freshman year, but now he's at Texas A&M in a much more talented room. He's got Marcel Reed throwing him the ball in an offense not good enough to really score a ton of points and not enough volume to make up for his lack of efficiency. I'm completely out on Kevin Concepcion this year.
I thought his freshman year was a little fool's goldy. So I've never quite been there on him after the fact. I think last year, probably swung further than it would have in a normal circumstance year with the QB situation there. But yeah, I'm not a huge Concepcion guy either. I mean, I just don't know. I don't believe in Marcel Reed. I think he's a big part of it as well. Anytime we saw Marcel Reed actually get a start in a defense a week to prepare for him, he was terrible. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not really buying any of the wide receivers in this offense, at least not for any sort of production purposes in 2025.
Yeah, again, like I said, Colin Klein just spreads the ball out too much for the most part as well. Like I don't see what you can point to with KC and say like this is what we're gonna hang our hat on outside of, hey, he was good 2 years ago. Just don't think it's there anymore. What about your last guy here? You got Matthew Coleman. His ADP is wide receiver 25, so end of the 7th round. I've got him ranked right where ADP has him. I got him at wide receiver 25. Why do you think he's going too high?
A couple of different reasons. It just sounds like all the noise out of San Jose State is not about him this offseason, which is a little concerning, especially for a smaller program. It's not like it's USC where we're just inundated by news. It's San Jose State. You'd figure if they were excited about a player, they would be talking about it. And Coleman, that really hasn't been the case. Sounds like maybe it's Danny Scudero, who I have been drafting a lot of because he's just cheaper. And I think that even if Coleman is the de facto one, I don't know that just based on that information, there may not be that much between the two of them. And there seems to be a pretty large gap in terms of, ADP and cost and all that kind of stuff on the two of them. So that's issue number one. And then issue number two, like I know this offense is just going to throw the ball a ton, like regardless of who's a quarterback. So I'm a little less concerned about this, but I'm not sure. Like Walker Egan, I think lowers ceiling at least to some degree over the course of a 12, 13 game, 11 game, whatever how many regular season games they're playing next year. I think he does lower the ceiling at least a little bit for these guys. And again, I realized like in his games last year, like he had 3 games of 58 attempts and a bunch more with like 35 plus. So I get that no matter who's back there, they're going to chuck the ball around. But this is a guy that completed like 56% of his passes, 13 to 10 touchdown to interception ratio. So are we just talking about, in terms of like touchdowns across the board, maybe not being there, also not great. I'm slightly concerned about the quarterback play. And then, I just think I don't know that he's like far and away the best wide receiver on this offense, or at least not enough to be priced that way compared to some of the other guys there. Because I know people like Leland, or who's the third guy there as well?
Leland Smith.
Leland Smith. I know people like him too, and could he factor in? Maybe.
Yeah, again, there's a lot to breakdown with San Jose State this year. You were kind of mentioning how, we don't get a lot of news and there's not a lot of buzz on Matthew Coleman. I will say there was one pretty big report, and I can't remember. It was an interview of one of the offensive staff members. I can't remember if it was Craig Stutzman, the offensive coordinator, or not, but like he was asked to name like 2 big receivers, and he named Matthew Coleman and Leland Smith, which is where the Leland Smith love really started. And so I think that was a pretty big one. But like you said, like the buzz has also been with Danny Scudero, the talk of, them sitting him towards the end of spring practice and them like wanting to save him for this year. I think that we are going to see quite a bit of both of those guys. And I think, how much Scudero factors into this is going to be the big wild card here, right? Because, people talk about Scudero like he was like this FCS giant coming up to San Jose State. He only got 680 yards and 5 touchdowns at Sacramento State last year. Granted, as a true freshman, he looked really good. Like if you watch the tape, like you can see the upside that can come from him. So I kind of get it a little bit, but this isn't like a guy that's like used to being the wide receiver 1 in his old school. He's not going to come to a place where he's not going to be the wide receiver 1. I think that there's a chance that we see San Jose State run a lot of 4 wide receiver sets this year, and you get both Coleman and Scudero on the field at the same time a lot. And from what it sounds like, again, we don't get a ton of information, but it does sound like both of them are going to stay at the slot, despite Coleman kind of being a pretty tall slot at 6 foot there. But between those 2 guys, there's 171 targets to distribute between the 2 of them with Nick Nash leaving, right? The question is, to me, how do those targets get split, and how much does it then take you to get to CFF relevance? If you split them 50-50 down the middle, give them both about 85 targets per person, yeah, you're looking at 59 receptions, 700 yards, 6 to 7 touchdowns for Coleman, 56 receptions, 709 yards, and 6-7 touchdowns for Scudero. Not great, right? You don't want, like, that's not going to get you very high in CFF. So you're kind of hoping, in my opinion, for a little bit more of a 60-40 split. Whichever guy that ends up being, you're aiming for that. Because that can get a guy like Coleman 103 targets, 71 receptions, 851 yards, 8 touchdowns. Scudero, very similar, 860 yards, 8 touchdowns. If one of them can kind of get that, I think you're still in line for some solid CFF production. I lean more towards Coleman due to him being in the system longer, him kind of matching the frame of Nash a little bit more than Scudero. I think they'll provide some familiarity there. But again, I think Scudero is a legitimate threat to potentially overtake and become the favorite target in the slot. But I think that's reflected well in my rankings. I got wide receiver 25 for Coleman, wide receiver 47 for Scudero. If I was super confident in either one of these guys, I'd have them top 10 in my rankings, because that's just the system we have here. Craig Stutzman's going to feed a slot. It's just we don't really know who that guy's going to be and what the ceiling is going to look like this year. But I think it still warrants, like, if you have a good feeling of one of these guys over the other, they should be in your top 25 wide receivers. Just again, because it doesn't take much for a guy to rise from wide receiver 47 to wide receiver 25 this year, in my opinion.
Fair enough.
All right, let's move on. Let's go talk. Let's quit the negative talk here, Austin. I know this will hurt your brain a little bit, but we have to talk positively about some of these guys. And so let's talk about some wide receivers we think are being drafted too low here. I'll start with my first guy here, and that's Ian Strong out of Rutgers. I was kind of shocked when I saw that he was going wide receiver 50 in ADP, kind of mid 14th round range. I've got him top 20 wide receivers. I got him wide receiver 16. I really, really think that people kind of forget that when Kirk Soraka has himself a top wide receiver, they tend to be fed, especially if he's had multiple years to work with him like he does here with Ian Strong. Like Damier Miller last year, I think people kind of forget he had the quietest 109 target season ever, right? Granted, he was in the slot, so, we didn't see like a ton of efficiency there, so he didn't really finish great in CFF, but that won't be the case with Ian Strong, I can tell you that much. Then you go back to 2021, I believe it was, where Kirk Soraka was the offensive coordinator for Penn State for a year. You saw Jahan Dotson get 84 targets in 9 games that year, 17 yards per catch. Obviously, Jahan Dotson then went on to be an NFL wide receiver, so you can kind of point to talent there. That's fine and everything, but then even before that, Kirk Soraka back at Minnesota, Tyler Johnson, 13 games, 119 targets, 1,300 yards, 13 touchdowns. When Soraka has himself a top wide receiver, they can be fed. It kind of oscillates between slot and outside guys, really depends on who he views as his best wide receiver. And this year, I think Ian Strong is very clearly that best guy. He played second fiddle to Dymere Miller last year for Rutgers, but at times, in my opinion, I think he looked like the better wide receiver. He averaged 15.7 yards per catch, 2.25 yards per route run. He had more yards after catch per reception than Dymere Miller. He had less drops. Like, the list goes on. I think he was just a better performing wide receiver than Dymere Miller last year. And quite frankly, it seems like a shame that, Dymere Miller got all those targets and not Strong. This year, he's really all alone outside of DT Sheffield, who, he should start in the slot, but you guys already know how I feel about a lot of these G5 to Power 4 transfers. I don't think DT Sheffield's really one of those guys that is set to translate as well as some other guys. So that once again kind of leaves Strong on an island for me. And because of that, I don't think there's much choice for them to go except for feed Strong in the passing game. Like, if that's the case, I think he'd easily hit 100 targets based on last year. And, Jahan Dotson's 2021 season, based on last season and based on what Jahan Dotson was able to do in 2021, I think if he gets 100 targets, he's got a really nice floor, about 850 yards, 8-ish touchdowns, really, really solid floor for CFF purposes. So I think people should be taking Ian Strong a lot more seriously. I've drafted him a ton this offseason.
Strong's the guy I've been wondering about because I don't see I don't see the vision that much. I just am a little skeptical of Cali McManus.
That's a very, very legitimate concern.
And that's what's been holding me back here. And Rutgers as a whole, I think, takes a little bit of a step back this year. So, unfortunately.
Yeah, fair enough. Again, I agree with you. That's a very legitimate concern. But also, again, like, Kyle McManus, for better or for worse, will be God, is he going to be like a 5th-year, 6th-year guy at this point? Like, he'll be in his last year this year.
Has he
like,
been around that long?
He's been around for a long time,
Time
dude.
flies.
So like he'll be a veteran quarterback at this point. Like, he knows Soraka's system. I'm hoping they kind of let him loose a little bit more, especially when they don't have, oh my God, why am I blanking on the running back's name from last year?
He's on the Bears now.
He is.
Menongai.
Yeah, like, they don't have Menongai this year. I like Antoine Raymond. I like CJ Campbell. But, like, if neither one of those guys step up to the plate like Menongai did, maybe they got to rely on Cali McManus more. I know that's a scary thought, but, with him having multiple years in the system, I think it could end up working out. What other guy you got here, Austin? You want to talk about Lewis Bond, wide receiver out of Boston College. Let's talk about this.
I like Lewis Bond, Jared, and he's one of the handful of guys this year that you can't talk me out of no matter how hard you try. And then I look back 6 weeks into the season, I'm like, Jared, why didn't you talk me out of Lewis Bond? You cannot do it, and that's what's going to happen. I like him, and we're talking about some of these guys that, quote unquote, like, were, they're floor players. They weren't that efficient last year, and blah 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 blah. But I feel like Bond, like, at 85 targets last year. And that was with Castellanos through the first half of the year. After post Castellanos, we saw a pretty good target floor: 10, 8, 8, 9, 7, 8, 3, 11, and 7 to end the season. Like, that's a pretty solid run. I think this is more of a PPR play than like a half PPR or no PPR kind of play. Because 60 for 591 and 3 doesn't seem like that great of a stat line, but I expect, another 15, 20 targets, add on some more receptions. I think we'll see the touchdowns increase a little bit as well. I expect this passing attack as a whole, whether it's a return of Grayson from last year, I think he'll settle in a little bit better, or it's that he loses the job and it's the guy that came over from Bama, Lonergan, who I think is, moderately talented, probably a better quarterback than what they had last year. So I like Bond, obviously not as like a wide receiver 1 or as a wide receiver 2 or even the 3. I've been taking him on my C2C rosters. I like to try to have like 12-ish wide receivers that I feel like I could plug into a lineup in any given week, 10 to 12. Mm-hmm. And I usually try to get like my wide receiver 8 or 9. And I think that there's a lot of weeks where I might just be willing to pop him in because there's buys, there's injuries, and I think he's going to be good for, between 8 and 10 targets and about 80 yards. And, you got to flip a coin whether you get a touchdown that week or not. I like that value at where he's going.
Yeah, I think he'll definitely kind of improve upon last year in several ways. Like, I So his stat line last year in the regular season, 85 targets, 60 catches, 591 yards, 3 touchdowns. My projections are keeping at that 85 targets because I think it'll kind of even out a little bit, especially with the rise of Reed Harris kind of coming in. I do kind of question how much higher Bond's target share will kind of get. But I got him at 85 targets, 58 receptions, 698 yards because he did kind of have a much better season the year before. So that'll kind of bump him up a little bit. And then again, I do project him for about 6-7 touchdowns rather than the 3 he got last year. Still doesn't get him very high in my wide receiver rankings. Now, granted, as I've said over and over with this show, like, I could give him 5 more targets and he could probably jump up like 30 spots in my rankings. And, like, it doesn't take that much for him to finish higher here. But again, a couple of things that I just don't really love. One, you can't really point to any game, much like Carnell Tate, where I'm sitting there being like, yes, there's the ceiling. Like, if he could get that more consistent week to week, like, he's a CFF play. The only game I can really point to is Michigan State, where he had 10 targets, 102 yards, and a touchdown. Meanwhile, he never broke 100 yards in any other game in the season. And as we kind of mentioned, the touchdowns opportunities were pretty low. Granted, when you have Grayson James and Thomas Castellanos as your quarterback, that's going to happen. That's why I'm hoping that Dylan Lonergan actually beats out Grayson James for Boston College this year, because I think he lifts that passing game a little bit more. And then the other thing is, I do think Reed Harris will be a factor here. He really kind of came on last year, very, very efficient wide receiver for Boston College. I'm curious to see how him and Bond kind of split targets this upcoming year. But otherwise, again, like, he's going late enough that, like, yeah, if you like him and you want to take him, round 17 versus round 25 in ADP, I'm not gonna fight you too much on it.
That's right. You're not gonna fight me that much on it.
No, I will not. And that'll be a running theme with these 3 wide receivers in this range, because you picked a lot of guys that go pretty late in ADP. Which actually, what am I saying? That's the whole point of this segment.
Yeah, I followed the assignment.
You did. All right. Meanwhile, I'll talk about a guy that's actually going pretty high in drafts already, but I think he could go even higher, and that's Jeff Caldwell out of Cincinnati. ADP last month had him at a wide receiver 74. This month's ADP has him at wide receiver 51, so he's definitely rising. He's now in the mid 14th round. I've got him at wide receiver 43. I think he could definitely be higher. Once again, in a year where we're not seeing a ton of safe plays at wide receiver, I do think the wide receiver 1 for Scott Satterfield is a great place to take a look at, because if you look over the last several seasons, Xavier Henderson, 2 years in a row, 99 targets, 98 targets. Decent efficiency, 12.7 and 13.4. And then you look before that, during Satterfield's time at Louisville, Tyler Hudson, 102 targets, 1,000 yards, 2 touchdowns. Really don't like how little touchdowns some of these guys get. But Des Fitzpatrick back in Louisville, 73 targets, 831 yards, 3 touchdowns. Tutu Atwell, 71 targets in just 9 games. So, a lot of volume opportunity here. And then Tutu Atwell the year before, 104 targets, 1,270 yards, 12 touchdowns. Like, when Satterfield finds himself a number 1 guy, he will get fed. And as I mentioned before, I'm not normally a fan of chasing some of these lower tier guys moving up to the Power 4, but I can't ignore the buzz we've been hearing out of Cincinnati's camp. They love Caldwell. They really think that he'll be a big part of this offense this year. He comes by way of Lindenwood. He put up fantastic efficiency numbers all 3 years that he was there. It's very clear that Caldwell is playing well above his level of competition when he was there at Lindenwood. So now he's at Cincinnati, who is very much in need of a new top outside threat with Xavier Henderson God. I think that he'll slide right into that. I know that Cyrus Allen comes in by way of Texas A&M and Tulsa, or not Tulsa, Louisiana Tech, but he didn't do much at Texas A&M last year, and Caldwell's had all the buzz, so I'm going to lean towards Caldwell being the Henderson replacement here, and I think that warrants him going higher than he is in drafts right now.
I like Caldwell. I've drafted a lot of them this offseason, mostly thanks to you. So, yeah, well, I'm right there with you.
There we go. All right, let's talk about Xavier Townsend, wide receiver out of Iowa State. I already kind of hinted that I'm not super in on him, but I'm always willing to hear guys that are in on guys late. So what do you think, Austin?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's probably a little more of a floor guy. Again, I'm not expecting crazy yardage numbers, but I do think in PPR leagues again that this is a guy that I'm pretty heavily targeting in mid to late rounds of drafts. I think part of it's just due to the fact that we talked about, the quarterback continuity at Iowa State, but they lose their top two receivers, and they seem like they brought in two guys that fit these two roles that just left perfectly. And we already talked earlier about Chase Sal, but now Xavier Townsend kind of filling that Jalen Noel role. I think we haven't. Townsend has been a slow build over the past couple of years, and I think it's because he came into college as a running back and then converted to wide receiver. And so there's been, I think, a little bit of a learning curve there for him. But I do think if you're running, you know, it would be a little reductive to say, Jalen Noel was like a low A dot, kind of guy, because that's not exactly what he was.
Not at all.
And that is slightly more Townsend's game. But I do think that he can do some of the things that Noel was asked to do last year. I think he's a good enough athlete to do it. Am I expecting quite a Noel year last year? Noel in the regular season, 103 targets, 67 catches, 1,000 yards, 6 touchdowns. I think the target number is going to be close to that. And I actually think the reception number is going to be close to that as well. I just think the big question mark is going to be what's the difference on the yardage and touchdowns.
It really is a massive question because,
Yeah,
you look at these numbers for Townsend, they're not pretty. In his career, he's averaged 7.9 yards per catch, which is abysmally low, even for a slot guy. You're wanting to see a slot guy at least get 10 yards per catch. And it's hard to tell who to blame here, right? Because it part of it could be on Townsend. Like you said, he's moving over from running back. Could also very well be that Gus Malzahn was trying to get way too cute with Townsend constantly. He was very much a gadget guy for Malzahn. Didn't really play a ton of just straight wide receiver for UCF during his time while he and Malzahn were there. So I don't think it's really entirely fair of me to say oh, well, look at his terrible efficiency. He's not going to translate at Iowa State if he didn't translate at UCF. But it's still there in the back of my mind. It is something I think we have to kind of keep in mind here that, some people are like, oh, he's a 1-to-1 replacement for Noel. I really don't think so at all. I think he will kind of come in. Like you said, he might get the targets, but boy, it might come in at much lower receiving total. Because again, I got him projected about 85 targets, which is what Noel did the previous years before that. 59 receptions, 691 yards, 6 touchdowns. Again, just not a great stat line for me to really want to invest in. But, if he's going late enough, again, ADP's got him at wide receiver 74, so about, 19th, 20th round. Maybe I take a shot on him. I don't know. There's still a lot of wide receivers in that range that I feel pretty good about chasing over him. I don't know. I'm not super in on Townsend, but once again, this is a guy going late enough that I'm not gonna knock anybody for wanting to go after him. That's kind of my whole thing with wide receiver this year. I don't really as I was deciding on guys that I think are going too high, too low. There are some guys that obviously I had very strong opinions on, like Miles Coleman and stuff like that. But especially a lot of these late guys in terms of who should be going higher and stuff like that. I'm not gonna knock on anybody who says a guy that's going round 25 should be going round 15. Because I'll be honest, in my projections, there's not much difference between those guys. And so, yeah, I'm not going to just, I'm not super in on Townsend, but I'm not going to knock you too much. I feel like I said a whole lot of nothing there in the last 45 seconds to a minute. It's getting late, y'all. This is what happens when Jared gets, recording too late at night and didn't drink enough tea beforehand. Let's finish up here with our guys that are going too low in our opinions. And last guy here, again, like I mentioned, it was hard for me to pick out guys that I think were kind of being drafted too low because, I don't think there's a huge difference between the guys going around 25 versus round 17, 18 and stuff like that. So I just picked out a guy here, Quayshawn Brown out of Duke. I've got him ranked wide receiver 43. ADP's got him wide receiver 79. Late 20th round. Very solid as a redshirt freshman last year. 54 targets, 41 receptions, 445 yards, 2 touchdowns. Played in the slot last season, but is now moving to the outside this year. That outside position is vacating 190 targets between Pankel and Moore. last season. Duke threw the ball 400 times with Malik Murphy, of all people, at quarterback. They get Darian Menson now. This is going to be an offense that's going to want to throw the ball even more this year. So I think we should be investing in these wide receivers who are set to be the top targets for them. And like I said, this typically comes to wide receivers on the outside, especially under offensive coordinator Jonathan Brewer, who comes by way of the Rhett Lashley coaching tree. They typically love their outside guys there. And, if you look at the three options there at Duke, you got Amir Hagans, you got obviously Keyshawn Brown here, and then they bring in the Barkate from Harvard. Of those three options, like Brown, I think is pretty clearly significantly, more projectable than those other two guys. And considering that, again, as a redshirt freshman last year, he was producing pretty well for this team, I think it's pretty clear he'll be the wide receiver one for them. The only thing that kind of holds me back is, again, Brown significantly smaller than either Pankel or Moore. I question his ability to translate on the outside there, but as we've seen with the staff, they want to put their best guys on the outside. They put Brown there. I feel pretty good about that. What do you think about Brown this year, Austin?
I like Brown a lot, but this is an offense that I think is going to be pretty pass happy again this year. I like the quarterback upgrade quite a bit, and so Brown. None of them are actually going early, so I have grabbed a couple of these guys, but I think between Brown and then Barkade and Antrell Anthony, as like a super late guys behind Brown, I've been dabbling a little bit in all three of them. Yeah, I can get there.
All right, your last guy here, Austin, Jordan Dwyer out of TCU. Again, I don't have too much thoughts on this. It kind of falls into the same category that we've been discussing. He goes late enough that I'm not going to hate on anybody for taking him. I love Eric McAllister, but I think there's room for somebody else to eat here. I've taken my fair share of Jordan Dwyer. His ADP is wide receiver 94, 25th round. Once again, another guy that I'm going to take him. He's great where he's at, and if you want to take him a couple rounds earlier, totally fine by me.
Yeah, it's just, I'm buying pieces of this offense. This isn't necessarily a what if we're wrong and Eric McAllister isn't the wide receiver one, but it's more of what if he's not the one by that much, which I think is certainly an outcome that's possible. And so I've been dabbling in Dwyer quite a bit this year. And actually I've grabbed Manjack, whatever, once or twice as well, although I feel a little less comfortable about that than I do about Dwyer. But I
typically
think both are nice late round kind of guys.
Yeah, it's typically the outside guys that have done well under Sonny Dykes and everything. So I don't blame you for wanting to go Dwyer over Manjack, and his efficiency at the FCS level was obviously great. Now, does that translate to the Power 4? We'll see. But I don't think Dwyer really needs that many targets behind McAllister to be CFF relevant. I've got him at 75 targets in my projections right now. That gets him to 39 yards. If I bump that up to about 80, I'm curious to see where that kind of puts him at. See if my brain's working fast enough for me to be able to do this in a timely manner here real quick as I continue to ramble on and find him in my rankings. There we go. Yeah, if I bump him up to 80 targets, that bumps him up to about 785 targets. So not quite the 800 yards that I'm really looking for, but still, I think it's pretty reasonable that, if McAllister finishes with 100 targets, if Dwyer's truly that secondary outside guy, he could finish with about 75, 80 targets, and that'll be good, at least for best ball options, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Last slide we'll get to here, Austin. I know we're kind of running a little long here, so we'll get through this pretty quickly here. But as with quarterbacks and running backs, there are certain things in the fall, or certain rooms in the fall, that we're going to have our eye on here, and we're going to highlight two of them here. I want to take a look at the Oklahoma State wide receiver room. A room that I think a lot of people have kind of not thrown under the bus, but it's kind of gone under the radar for a lot of people but also, dang, this wide receiver, Mike Gundy sure knows how to produce some wide receivers, man. Dejon Stribling last year, even probably the worst year for Mike Gundy, wide receiver in a long time, 882 yards, 6 touchdowns on 92 targets. Brendan Presley just got fed a monstrous amount of targets at 131. Year before that, Brendan Presley, the same thing, 143 targets in 14 games. Rashad Owens, 99 targets, both of them north of 890 yards. And then, need I say more about Tay Martin, Tylan Wallace for 3 years, James Washington? What he has is guys, you're talking about just elite production at the wide receiver place. And so I think it's worth taking a look at the three guys here that I think people are kind of looking at here. You got Terrell Davis, the transfer coming in from Central Oklahoma, so jumping up quite a few spots here quite a few levels of competition here, but a lot of buzz that he'll be in that starting lineup for this year. And boy, he did so well at Central Oklahoma last year. 109 receptions, 1,609 yards, 15 touchdowns. Obviously, we're not expecting him to translate that to the Big 12, but definitely something to keep an eye on there. Christian Fitzpatrick comes in from Marshall in his final year. He looked really good at Marshall last year, 79 targets, 35 receptions, 16.8 yards per reception. Obviously, he'll need to catch the ball quite a bit more than, 44% of the time, but another guy I'm keeping an eye out for that potential outside position. And then they bring in Jalen Lloyd from Nebraska, who was, he played in the slot, a little bit on the outside, and hyper efficient guy. Like in his freshman year, he had almost 40 yards a catch. Obviously, do not expect him to translate that ever again. But then he followed it up the next year with nearly 20 yards a catch. So clearly a guy that can kind of create some space. Not much information out there on this room for the most part. We got one depth chart out of 247 that had Terrell Davis as part of the starters, and then Dwayne Lofton, and then another guy, Io Shotomide King. I definitely butchered that like you wouldn't believe.
Great. That was really good.
This is not a name that you need to be giving me at 9:42 at night. So like those are your three starting wide receivers for them. But I also kind of questioned that because, Gavin Freeman, I think, should be kind of in the conversation for potential starters here. Jalen Lloyd, as I just mentioned. Christian Fitzpatrick comes in here after fighting to get another year here. Very much a wide receiver room up in the air, and I think if you can nail this wide receiver room, all these guys are going super late. It could pay off massively as the season gets started. Do you have any thoughts on the Oklahoma State wide receiver room, Austin?
Not really. Honestly, I've kind of avoided the whole offense outside of Rodney Fields all offseason, and that even feels a little iffy to me. Are we seeing the end of the run there for Gundy at Oklahoma State?
I mean, quite possibly.
Yeah.
Again, he last year very much he felt checked out. Like I think he's kind of done with the whole NIL thing. I think and again, people are like, oh, well, he doesn't like that players are getting paid. I think he's fine that players are getting paid. I think that he just hates that he has to be the one that deals with that. Right? I think he's the one, like, he's like, I just want to be out here coaching football. I don't want guys coming into my office demanding to get paid. I don't want to deal with that. He just wants to go out and coach football. And so I think that, again, if these two coordinator hires they made after last year don't really work out, I do think that you'll probably see him retire at the end of the year. I think he'll just be done. Either that or he becomes an offensive coordinator somewhere where that, like, all he has to do is worry about creating an offense.
So it's starting to become like, for me, is this going to be like he goes out with a whimper or a bang is where I've been starting to
knowing Gundy, that it could very well be either direction. The rule I've learned with Gundy over the years is that if you expect him to be bad, he's gonna be good. If you expect him to be good, he's gonna be bad. It's been such an oscillating program year after year, and you never really know what to expect out of them. So now that I'm here trying to play the guessing game of like, well, people think they're gonna be bad, so they'll probably be good. Maybe I should draft one of these wide receivers, and then it's gonna bite me in the butt anyway.
Yeah.
Austin, you want to talk about the Syracuse wide receiver room here? The three names I kind of threw up here: Jonte Cook out of formerly of Texas, now at Syracuse there; Darrell Gill Jr., one of the veterans here, and then Justice Ross Simmons, who a guy we liked at Colorado State, came to Syracuse last year, participated, was on the field and everything, but wasn't like a clear next man up or anything. How are you breaking down this wide receiver room?
Yeah, I think all these players are legitimately talented, and then obviously there's question mark, a different question mark for all of them. I think undoubtedly Jonte Cook is the most talented guy here as kind of the, conductor of the Jonte Cook hype train coming into college for him. His offseason was very concerning with all the legal issues, bouncing around to multiple schools. if there's a coach that I think maybe, and this feels weird because he's only been there for 1 year, but that seems like he has the personality and kind of the chops to mentor a guy like Jonte Cook, it might be Fran Brown, who's there at Syracuse, and potentially kind of help him get back on track, because I do think that he is a legitimate NFL player if he can get his head on straight. So I think that's the big question mark. Other than that, I mean, yeah, I do think that it's either Cook or Gill, with Ross Simmons kind of a distant third unless somebody gets injured. We saw a little bit out of Gill last year, and obviously had that big game against UConn. It's UConn, whatever. But with how much is cleared out in front of him, I do think it's it's a pretty natural, kind of inclination to think that he's probably the next guy up there. I've been drafting quite a bit of Gill this offseason as well. A little less Ross Simmons. I think the big thing for me with Syracuse that maybe will make us not care about this is that I what happened last year, is that what they want to do every single year, or is because they kind of lucked into Kyle McCord? It's just the $1 million question for Syracuse, because they do have what we think is probably a pretty competent running back there, and you've seen Willis. Do they maybe go a little heavier on the ground, scale it back a little bit, both in terms of just raw pass plays that they're running and kind of the pace of play and all that kind of stuff? I mean, I think those are going to be some interesting questions that maybe end up making this discussion less relevant, or maybe not less relevant, but maybe we care. I mean, if we figure out who the first guy is, that's the only guy we end up caring about. So I do think it's anybody's guess. I don't think I have a great feel either way on the what does this offense look like question. So for me, I think you have to roll with Gill just because of what the uncertainty around Cook. Like, would it shock anybody if by week 3 Jonte Cook isn't with the team anymore? That wouldn't surprise me at all, based on what he's done over the last year of his life.
It also wouldn't shock me if he had 30 targets through 3 games.
Wouldn't shock me either, because I just think he's so good. So yeah, I mean, but I do think it comes down to one of those two, and then really we don't get dabbling into the third guy until we see this offense be as prolific as it was last year.
I think that I threw Justice Ross Simmons up here mostly due to the summer school episode that Bud Elliott did with their Syracuse beat reporter over at 247. Because when he asked about like impact wide receivers, it was Ross Simmons' name that came out of the guy's mouth. And so I think, again, obviously the guys at 247, they're not infallible, but they are connected. And so I do think that is a data point to kind of consider there. And I do think that, if you're going to trust a guy at 247 and that's the first name that comes out of his mouth, Ross Simmons is free 99. So, Austin, you've said it all night, right? Just taking shots of guys and systems that you like. Why not take the shot on, Ross Simmons when he's going, 10, 20, even 30 rounds after Cook and Gill are off the board, right? Like, if you think there's even a smidge chance that he could be the wide receiver 1 or even 2, as we saw last year, you can have 2 guys that are relevant here. Why not take that shot? But I agree with you. I've drafted more Cook than Gill because Cook goes after Gill a lot of times in drafts. And I think, again, I'm shooting for the upside there more than Gill. Cooks goes late enough, like in the 14th, 15th round, that if he ends up being a bust, I'm pretty confident in the wide receivers I draft after him to kind of make up for that.
Gill's fallen pretty far in C2C drafts this year, like in supplemental drafts, 6th, 7th round. And so at that point, like I think it's a really nice price for him. So I have him and Senecal have been like the 2 that I click in that range pretty much, without hesitation every single time.
Let me see if I can find them in our late. Yeah, Gill is going as wide receiver 30 in ADP for CFF this past month, and then Cook is down at wide receiver 76. And then let's see, do we have? It does not appear that Justice Ross Simmons is in our top 30 round ADP. So, again, very big gap between all 3 of these guys. I'd rather take the shot on Cook and the upside there. Again, we're not going to go through these, but I will throw out some teams, wide receiver rooms that I'm keeping an eye on as the fall goes along that we just didn't have time to really dive into here. Memphis is a big one. I think CJ Smith or Brady Cluse, there's one guy, at least one guy there I think could end up being CFF relevant. Wake Forest, Carlos Hernandez versus Micah Mays, if anybody emerges there. Sam Houston, I've discussed before, Malik Phillips or Quavez Humphreys, who's the main guy there. Miami of Ohio, We know that Chuck Martin loves to have himself a top wide receiver there, so who emerges there? Southern Miss, Blake Anderson. We know they'll have a top end wide receiver. It's just a matter of, I don't think we're going to find out until the season actually starts. And then one that kind of flies under the radar is New Mexico State. I think people don't realize that David Yost is their offensive coordinator now. If you don't recognize that name, he was the offensive coordinator for Florida International the last couple of years. And boy, he loves himself some outside wide receivers. Think of your Tyrese Chambers. Think of your Eric Rivers last year. There's another name I'm forgetting off the top of my head here. But like, he will pick an outside wide receiver and feed them. So I'm curious to see if anybody emerges there before the season actually gets started. But Austin, any of those, like real quick, that really intrigue you, or any other wide receiver rooms you want to throw out there?
I would just say I'm not interested in Memphis because I just don't believe in Brendan Lewis at all.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough.
So that's one I like. Last offseason, I probably over committed to Memphis offense a little bit, which also did not work that well for me, at least relative to the price I was paying. But yeah, this year I am so far out. It's like the least sexy group of names I've ever seen on an offensive depth chart in my life. Wild the turn that they've taken.
I mean, again, like CJ Smith's got himself some speed, so like I think they like
CJ. You could not pay me to roster CJ Smith, and we don't need to get into that discussion today. I just think he's objectively awful. Like,
I mean, to be fair,
terrible.
if he couldn't really break out at Purdue last year, that's a bit of a warning sign.
Yeah. I know he caught like a long touchdown in the spring game or whatever, but like I just don't care. I just don't care.
Austin out on CJ Smith.
Yes.
Yeah. With that being said, we've come to the end of our show. Austin, I appreciate you for doing this. Again, these crash courses are long, and you do a ton of research for them, so I really appreciate you for that. Before we get out of here, can you give us a sneak peek on what we can expect for Campus to Canton going into the season? Anything in the works? What do we got?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had mentioned it the other day when we did the live show last week. Like nothing new launching. There were a couple of things that we were dabbling to try to get done that just didn't quite get there this offseason. There's one thing in the works that I literally just can't talk about at all yet because it's in a very early stage, but it'd be really cool if we can do it. So my fingers are crossed. But as the season approaches here, we do our tailgate show every Saturday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern kicks off. We do basically just all fantasy, basically cover the games as a pregame show, but from a fantasy betting perspective, which I think is a lot of fun. We also will be doing the late night wrap up shows, Matt Bruning and I. And then I know we just have a ton of different, weekly waiver and stuff like that kind of content that's going to be coming out, whether it's, you writing it or, Chris is going to be pretty active in the Discord and stuff like that. The best ball group, the guys. So, I mean, I think as we're kind of ramping up toward the season, all of those things are really kind of starting to come together. And so, yeah, I'd be checking that all out over at campuscan.com.
Yep, the in-season grind is coming faster than we're expecting.
Yeah, say goodbye to the wife and kids for 13 weeks, and that's what I do on the weekends.
There you go. With that, everybody, appreciate all of you guys for tuning in. We have come to the end of our show. Appreciate all of you guys for listening. If you have not already, leave a like, a comment, and a subscribe if you're watching this on the YouTube side of things. You're on the podcast, make sure you follow the show, leave a 5-star review wherever you can. Check out the rest of the Campus to Canton podcast network for shows ranging on pretty much anything you can think of related to the college fantasy games. We'll see you guys back here. We'll be doing our last crash course series. We'll be doing the tight ends. We'll be doing the kickers. We'll be doing the defenses all in one show. We'll see what godforsaken soul I get on here to guest and talk about that. But again, really appreciate all of you guys. Until then, have a wonderful and blessed week. See y'all.